If you don't know who I am, I'm the most recent chair. I say that because I guess I'm the third this year, I think. So we've had a little bit of turnover. So first and foremost, welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to participate in today's Graduate Education Advisory Committee. I'm officially calling this meeting to order, and immediately I'd like to acknowledge and welcome a handful of new members that we have. And if you would, just kind of raise your hand and wave so everyone can see where you are, but I'll announce your names. Debrena Agbeniga, Vice Provost and Dean, the Graduate School at University of Texas, San Antonio. Blanca Bauer, Assistant Vice President of Academic Assessment and Effectiveness, the UT Health Science Center at San Antonio. Richard Berry, he's the Dean of the Graduate School from Stephen F. Austin State University. Joanne Canales, I saw her earlier, there she is. Hi, Joanne. Dean, College of Graduate Studies, Texas A&M Corpus Christi, and also I guess now the past president of the Association of Texas Graduate Schools. Andrea Golato, Dean of the Graduate College at Texas State University, and now the current president of the ATGS, and Thomas Kruger. Okay, Professor, Texas A&M University, Kingsville. And Holly Hanson-Thomas, Interim Dean of the Graduate School, Texas Women's University. And last but certainly not least, our most recent student representative, Arabi Nagasundar from the University of North Texas Health Science Center. So welcome to all of you. And I look forward to getting to know all of you and getting your thoughtful inputs on the issues at hand. The first item after we've called this meeting to order is the consideration of summary notes, which I presume is the minutes. And I'd like to entertain a motion to approve. Thank you. Dr. Lumpkin moves. Second? Second. Thank you, Karen. And we'll open it up for any discussion, comments, modifications. Hearing none or seeing none. All in favor of approving the minutes as stated, the summary notes as stated, please say aye. Any opposed? Abstain? Thank you. Motion carries. Okay, moving right along, we're going to jump in and thank Dr. Goldman. And is Rita here today?
No, she. Rita sends her regrets. She wasn't able to make it this week.
That's okay. Thank you. So the next item on the agenda is the presentation on the upcoming RAND Corporation study on graduate education in Texas. I think all of you received a copy of the initial report from the RAND Corporation, and at this point I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Goldman.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be with you again. What I'd like to do is present a fairly quick overview. Those of you who are continuing on the committee will have seen this material at our previous discussions, but just to bring everybody up to date and for the benefit of some new members. And so I'll try to move through this fairly quickly, and then we can have an open discussion about any comments that you have on the report. As I've told you, we're conducting this study in part to help you and the coordinating board think about strategic planning. The 60 by 30 strategic plan calls for an 80% increase in higher education degrees and certificates over the next 15 years. Now, the plan doesn't set a target for graduate education specifically, but it seems logical that you'd also expect a significant growth in the graduate sector. We have three objectives in the study. First is look at the need to expand graduate education in Texas. Second, provide guidance to the coordinating board and to institutions on preparing and evaluating program proposals. And third, analyzing policies that can manage the expansion of graduate programs in Texas. We conducted this study with 7 tasks. We looked at the programs that currently exist at public institutions in Texas. We looked at selected other states' policies and practices. We compared Texas's position in graduate education and research to 3 other large states in the country. We looked at the program offerings as compared to the state's economic needs and projections. We conducted case studies in 6 example fields. We selected the fields to represent a diversity of different types of graduate education, not because we wanted to make statements in particular about those 6 individual fields, but because we wanted to sample different fields to get a sense of what the issues are in graduate education. We visited 12 public higher education institutions, 10 general academic and 2 health-related across the state of Texas. We spoke to presidents, provosts, graduate deans, and typically about 3 of the 6 fields that we selected, we visited about 3 or so at each of the 12 institutions. So we didn't try to cover all 6 fields at every institution, but we tried to get a good sampling. And then finally, we analyzed all of that information to try to recommend ways to improve the proposal preparation and review process, and also to make some more general recommendations. We've circulated to you the draft report, and following today's meeting, it's my understanding that we'll be circulating that for public comment as well. We'll give the members of the public about a month to read and submit comments. We're going to ask that people who would like to make comments on the report send them directly to me. We will provide back to you and the coordinating board a summary of the comments that we received, the themes that were raised, but we will not identify the individual people who made the comments, because we want people to feel comfortable that if they have something to say, they should let us know, and that it's for the benefit of improving the study and the report, and not for the purpose of identifying them.
Just a quick question on that. Is it, after today, is it all right if we circulate this at our universities to deans and provosts?
Why don't we wait until the coordinating board's going to put out, probably early next week, put out a slightly updated version. We have a few edits to make based on some comments that we've already received. We'd like to do that before we circulate it, so I'd appreciate it if we just hold off a couple of days, and then, and I believe that the coordinating board will send out a letter to, I presume, to the heads of the institutions, at least heads and chief academic officers at graduate deans, and so once that goes out, then fair game to circulate. We'd like to get comments back, as I said, in about a month's time, give ourselves around a month or so to address those comments, make revisions and updates to the study, have a final draft in December, and then start the publication, the layout and publication process with the goal of having the final document edited and published in February. So let me very quickly skim over some of the highlights of the findings. First, I'll talk about the comparison of Texas's position in graduate education and research. We used a logic model to try to describe the relationship between inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. And so if we think about higher education institutions, for our purposes, they produce research, and they produce trained graduates. And you can see the little green piggy banks show the different funding streams that support that. So there's research and development funding, there's funding from the state, and of course there's funding from students and their families. Research and graduates combine to produce outcomes in the state, trained workforce, innovation, growth in business, maybe attracting businesses from other parts of the country, as well as institutional prestige. And all of these have an influence on the competitiveness of the state of Texas. So if we look at graduate degrees in particular, and what we're going to show you here is we selected Texas and the other three largest states in the country as comparison. So that's California, Florida, and New York. And we looked at every indicator over a 10-year span, if that was feasible in the data. And so what you can see is Texas has grown a fair amount, in fact, 41% increase in 10 years in graduate degree production. The other three states have also grown, although not as rapidly as Texas. And these are in absolute terms. In the report, we also show these same indicators scaled by population. And what you can see is actually Texas has caught up to the rate of production in California when you adjust for the size of population. The other point I want to make here, which is probably obvious to members of this committee, is if you notice the light blue, which represents public institutions, that accounts for most of Texas's production of graduate degrees, whereas in the other three states, there's a much more of a mix of public and private. And so that, I think, places special emphasis on policies toward public institutions and their graduate education and research, because the state of Texas does not have the highly prestigious and productive private universities that a state in particular like California or New York would benefit from. If we look at R&D funding from the federal government, which is, of course, the most important source of competitive research grant funding, we can see if the top line, I'm sorry, that the total's not shown here, but the total, except for deliberate increase during the stimulus after the Great Recession, total federal funding for research in higher education has essentially been flat. And if you look, for instance, at California's line or New York's line, which are the top two, you can see that over this 10-year span, they more or less end up about same place where they started. And this is not adjusted for inflation. You can see Texas, the heavier purple line. Texas actually has been declining in its share of federal research awards, particularly since the end of that stimulus funding. So if we look at Texas compared to California, which is the nation's leader in attracting this funding, Texas gets about a third of the dollars that flow to California. Or if you want to make it on a population equivalent basis, you could say Texas gets about half the research funding that California does. Now, despite the fact that federal R&D funding in Texas is declining, the number of recognized research universities in Texas has increased strongly. So if we look at the Carnegie classifications, which divides research universities into three tiers, R1, R2, and R3, and when you can see, you look at the Texas, the total bar, you can see has increased a substantial amount from 16 to 25, and a significant number of new R1 institutions. And that growth is stronger than what you see in the other three states we compared to. And just by frame of reference, the total number of Carnegie recognized research universities did increase by 20% over this 10-year period. So we would expect some increase just from the fact that research university activity is increasing generally in the country, but Texas is ahead of the rest of the country and ahead of the rest of these states. Now, if we look at international rankings, so we look at the indicators of the greatest institutional prestige, Texas actually lost one institution over this 10-year period. Texas and Florida each lost one. California and New York remained stable. And what's interesting is, unlike the previous chart, where the Carnegie classifications expanded to recognize 20% more institutions. We're using here the Shanghai Rankings Top 500, and by definition, the top 500 is a fixed quantity. And so if an institution, say in China, increases its research output to the point where it becomes ranked in the top 500, then some other institution is going to be displaced. And in fact, the US as a whole lost 13% of its spots on the top 500 list over this 10-year period. So losing one in Texas is actually right about on average with what's going on in the US. But it does show a contrast here that while Texas is increasing the number of research universities in a broad sense, it's not yet growing the number of top internationally ranked institutions. And in particular, if you look, I don't have the chart here, but look at the top 100. So California's got 13 institutions in the top 500, but 11 of those 13 sit in the top 100. Texas has got 10, only 4 of the 10 sit in the top 100. So there's a contrast between the kind of entry into the research university mission broadly and the competition at the highest levels. If we look at the production of degrees, what we've got on this chart is these are graduate degree completions in 2005 and 2014. So the red bar is 2005, the blue bar is 2014. And what you can see is most of the broad fields have grown over this time period. Business, education, and health have grown quite strongly. In Texas, health in particular has grown very strongly. Engineering, which is third from the bottom, is actually growing slowly in Texas, only about a 20% increase over this 10-year period. And the other 3 states we looked at are all growing graduate degrees in engineering faster than Texas. In fact, Florida, which is a considerably smaller state than Texas, and had fewer engineering graduate degrees 10 years ago, in this 10-year period has completely caught up to Texas. And I have to say, I found that surprising and noteworthy because I certainly don't think of the key economic sectors in the state of Florida as generating a very strong demand for engineering. Florida, for instance, has a lot of hospitality, a lot of healthcare because of its aging population, whereas Texas has industrial sectors, oil and gas, some manufacturing, and so forth, where you would expect to see, of course, high tech in various regions. So that might be some cause for concern and to thinking about in the planning. So let's look a little bit at the labor market. We did an analysis of the Texas Workforce Commission data. Now, one of the things that's complicated is the Texas Workforce Commission produces projections of occupational demand. They don't divide occupations into those that require graduate degrees or, in fact, any level of education. You have to infer that. So what we did is we followed a method. We used the Census American Community Survey to identify the percentage of Texans in each occupation that currently hold a graduate degree. So if managers, which is an occupational group, had, say, 30% of managers holding a graduate degree of some kind, we applied that 30% to the growth projection that the TWC produced for managers. And what you see on this chart is the aggregation of those percentages. And we included the top about a little more than 40 occupations in Texas that generate graduate demand. We aggregated them into these groups. And in the appendix of the report, you'll see a detailed table that has each one of those occupations with the different statistics that we use to calculate. And what you can see here is the projected demands are strongest in business, healthcare, and teaching. The TWC has also projected quite a lot of demand for lawyers. And I think that's a good example of why you shouldn't rely only on these kind of statistics. The TWC made their projections at a time when there was a lot of growth projected. The method that the TWC uses is they assume that each industry will continue to employ the same fraction of each occupation over time. So if, say, in the oil and gas industry, 1 out of every 100 workers was a lawyer, they will assume that if the oil and gas industry doubles in size, then there will still be 1 out of 100 jobs in that industry. And so if there's an occupation where demand is changing in a significant way, and we think that probably the demand for lawyers has gone down a lot, then those projections are not going to be accurate. And so it's important to use these as a general guide, but not to take them too literally.
Charles, if I may.
Mark, I'm sorry, could I get you to use your mic?
Thank you, Charles. I appreciate the data, but I have to confess, I think it's counterintuitive, especially if Texas is trying to position itself in a global knowledge-based economy. If indeed this is what the labor force projections are, I don't think we're going to be ready to meet the needs that we have through 2022 or 2025 if this is what we expect to do.
Well, these are the projections that TWC has put out in terms of what they're forecasting for occupational growth. I mean, one of the things that I took out some of the slides that we covered, I think, two meetings ago. There are two kind of cases, if you think about occupations. There are, kind of moderately sized occupations that are typically staffed by people with graduate degrees. And so you can have a little bit of growth in those generates a substantial demand. You can also have very large occupations, even if they have a low demand for graduate education. Growth in a large occupation is going to generate what we would forecast as this kind of demand. And so that's partly what's happening in business. Teachers are a very big occupational group in Texas. Teachers have about 25% graduate attainment in this state. And so, just the natural rate of population growth, which causes school districts to hire teachers and so forth, is going to generate thousands of demand for new graduate degrees. Whereas something like engineers, which might actually be highly connected to the knowledge economy and innovation, is a much smaller part of the labor force. So I think you have to be careful in what you draw from this. What I draw from this is there are certain demands that the kind of structure of the economy and population growth brings that you need to meet. And those are especially in business, healthcare, teachers at the K-12 level, and college and university faculty. Then there are the next occupations, the computer-related and the engineers, which have somewhat smaller demand profiles, but may have big impact on the economy, might have big impact on business decisions to choose Texas as a location, for instance. So, as I mentioned, we also made visits to 12 institutions, talked to administration and departmental level chairs and faculty. I'm going to quickly summarize a very long chapter in the report. What we found was a set of different motivations that institutions and departments pursue graduate programs. And we've tried to array them on this chart from motivations that operate at the institutional level to ones that are more specific to an individual department. So some of the institutions we visited are explicitly seeking to become a research-intensive university or to expand their research activities. Some are not necessarily targeting that broad institutional goal, but they're looking to become known in a particular niche, a field or a market, and maybe use that over time to move up in terms of their research classification. We also observed quite a lot of activity, which we sort of grouped under the term positive margin activities. That is, degree programs that institutions think they can start, which they believe will generate net revenues that they could use for other purposes. And many of these activities are online master's programs. Institutions typically said that it wasn't that demanding to recruit faculty to teach in these programs. They often have for-profit delivery partners that partner with them, so the university doesn't have to make a lot of investment, may not even have to recruit the students, and they see this as generating revenues that they can potentially use for other programs. Of course, that's connected to competition. So sometimes institutions are starting programs for competitive reasons. And we heard about some institutions that were trying to build and enhance their face-to-face master's or professional programs as a competitive strategy against the growth of online programs. So, well, they have that over there, but we have something different over here, and we're going to find our market. And finally, kind of at the more narrow field level, institutions certainly motivated by demand that they perceive in the labor market, by student demand, and there are important cases where labor market demand and student demand signals don't always point in the same direction. Students sometimes have certain interests in things that may not necessarily lead to high-paying jobs or jobs that are in demand, and vice versa. There may be fields that are in demand in the economy. One of the things that we certainly saw and heard a lot about is that in the engineering graduate fields, there are few domestic students who are proceeding on from their bachelor's degrees into these, particularly in engineering research graduate programs, whereas there is a vast number of overseas students who are eager to enter these programs. There are a couple of other points that we observed. And one of the things, we selected one of our 6 fields as an emerging multidisciplinary field. We looked particularly at geographic information science. It's a relatively new field. It's a field that blends content and skills from geography, from computer science, and from information science more generally. And we wanted to understand a bit more about how do you know when an emerging field has emerged to the point where it really warrants a graduate program. And that's a question that's kind of apart from whether a particular institution is equipped to deliver that program. And then finally, we also heard a fair amount. We had physical therapy as one of our fields, physical therapy and nursing. And in both, we heard a lot about the role of professional associations in trying to increase the credential level. So for instance, physical therapy has, over the course of a number of decades, has moved from a field in which the entry-level qualification was a bachelor's degree, then a master's degree, and now a professional doctorate. And we heard arguments about why that was necessary. Arguments about the role of these providers in the healthcare system and wanting to claim a greater degree of autonomy and to have that to be seen as a full professional. Nursing is not as sharp as that, but there is, there's been a huge growth in the doctorate of nursing practice in the past decade or so, and I think motivated by broadly similar concerns. The healthcare system, I think, broadly would like nurses to take on more responsibility in patient care and delivery, particularly delivery of relatively routine healthcare services. It's helpful in areas of the country where there may be a shortage of physicians. It also could be potentially a strategy to control cost growth in healthcare delivery. And so there's demand from the field for nurses to continue on in their education past the traditional associate's and bachelor's degrees to master's degrees and the professional doctorate. Let me sum up. I'm going to kind of talk through some of the broad conclusions, and then I've got some slides where I've put all the recommendations from the report on the slides, so we have them in front of us, and I'm hoping that will help us with the discussion. Texas has got a number of nationally and internationally competitive universities and health-related institutions. I didn't mention this. One of the artifacts, I think, in Texas is that because of your separation of the health-related institutions from the general academic institutions, I think that artificially depresses the number of Texas institutions that appear high in certain ranking lists. Academic medical centers are highly correlated with research activity. I think about half of all sponsored research is in the medicine and biomedical sciences, and so having an academic medical center with an active research program is right away an indicator of strong research performance. And so that, I think, is a little bit holds Texas down, certainly in positions on these rankings. There are a lot of institutions in Texas. Being competitive at the highest national and international levels is an expensive undertaking, requires large and sustained investments. And so our advice is that Texas ought to focus on the institutions that already have at least moderate research activity and to try to get those with moderate research activity up to higher levels and those with high levels up to even higher levels. We do think there'll be continue to be strong demand for graduate education in Texas, and that a lot of that demand is likely to be in fields where there's already strong demand. Some of that can certainly be met by expanding the intake in existing programs, but quite likely it's going to require some new programs. Adding new graduate programs, particularly those that are linked to research, has the potential to expand the number of nationally and internationally competitive universities, because that's a key driver. But I think you also want to be careful that prestige-seeking behavior is not an end in itself, and that it's linked to economic development and workforce needs in the state. Furthermore, there's also a concern that as institutions increase their research activity, and hence their prestige, they very commonly raise admission standards for undergraduate admissions. This is kind of a co-occurring phenomenon with increases in prestige. And that is a natural part of being a more selective, more prestigious institution. But I think you also want to worry about the access that students in communities around the state of Texas have to undergraduate education. That doesn't mean that those institutions have to lower standards to do it. There are other ways that institutions in your public and private higher education system can provide access, but it's something that's worth thinking about. So to sort of go through the recommendations, when thinking about Texas's position, in the report we talk about the funding programs that are provided for research specifically. And Texas has a kind of unique structure because you have, I think it's 6 systems that organize public higher education institutions, well, maybe more than 6 at least that are applicable to university level institutions. And the systems are not differentiated by mission. So for instance, if we look at a state like California, California's got 3 public systems of higher education. They're clearly differentiated by mission, and so the state can kind of naturally provide different funding intensity. You don't really have that mechanism here. And so as a result, it's important to continue to provide research funding that's targeted to research activity. also may want to consider some more flexibility in some of these programs. So we heard in particular about the governor's research initiative, which is intended to attract out-of-state researchers to establish research labs at Texas universities. That there's some of the institutions perceive that even though they might be able to attract some of these faculty, it's hard for them to raise the matching funds that are required. And so it might be worth rethinking some of that. We think about the institutional strategy that's related to graduate programs. We're recommending a clearer link between program proposals and institutional strategic planning, in particular for institutions that are trying to move into research doctoral programs, either as a new endeavor or as a significant expansion. And so thinking about the emerging research universities and the group of universities that might aspire to become emerging research universities. I think our view is that the state ought to broadly encourage institutions to expand their research activity. So we don't think you should just hold institutions back and say, no, that's not for you. But the institutional, the research doctoral proposals really ought to be supported by the entire institution's plan and strategy. So it's not just, well, we have some good faculty here in this department and we can get some good students and do that. There's a cultural shift that's required to move into a research-intensive mission, and it's important that that cultural shift be supported with resources, with policies like faculty teaching loads and so forth, and those policies are at the level of the institution. And as I said before, this holds a potential negative consequence for undergraduate student access, and so it's important to at least periodically consider what pathways students in different regions of the state have. I talked to you about the positive margin activities. We raise a concern about some of the development of these master's programs, in particular the online master's programs that are developed in concert with for-profit providers. The for-profit providers have very strong incentive to rapidly increase the scale and lower the resources devoted, because that's how they make their profit. And those incentives may be at odds with the mission and incentives of a public higher education institution. And currently, a lot of these programs don't require a full coordinating board review because they don't exceed the threshold of $2 million in new investment. Many times we found the online programs, at least in the case studies we did, were repackaging of old master's programs that have been on the books for a long time. Sometimes were all but dormant. And the institution said, oh, well, you know, we can kind of put our new online program in this. And so the level of review is pretty light for those things because it's essentially existing. But it's one thing to say, well, we have this master's program and, you know, we have 10, 15 students a year going through it. And it's quite a different thing to say, okay, well, we're going to tie up with this company, and now we're going to have 500 students enrolled in this program in an online format. The difficulty is it's not really the coordinating board's mission to supervise quality of programs in an ongoing way. I mean, really, that ought to be the job of the accreditors if there's kind of serious concerns. But I guess our concern about the accreditors is that even if these online programs are growing pretty rapidly, the institution level accreditation cannot afford to spend the time delving into all the individual programs, especially at a big institution. So they may not be getting that much attention. So it may be worth thinking about ways to manage quality, maybe greater encouragement or incentives for either pursuing program accreditation or for having some kind of alternative external review. In the area of competition, we certainly heard a lot about competition from the institutions we visited. A number of the institutions suggested that these systems could actually do more to at least manage competition more productively within the system, even if it's difficult to do it across systems. In the area of labor market demand, everybody recognizes that they need to show labor market demand for new graduate programs. But frankly, the typical approach to this is, kind of sift through publicly available data, maybe some professional association reports, and, kind of look for facts that support the program that you'd like to propose and say, okay, well, our faculty are really interested in this. Maybe we're hearing from employers, so let's see what's TWC have. And so we think the institutions could do a more systematic job, and that maybe there are now tools that make access to this data easier. A number of institutions are already using them. We've suggested that the coordinating board provide more guidance on sources of data and potentially organize some kind of statewide bulk purchase or license to provide better access that institutions could have and be more convenient. Another aspect of demand is tracking graduate job placement, of course, which would be information of great value to prospective students. The downside here is that for large programs, this could be an expensive undertaking for institutions. We recognize that tracking graduates from a large number of programs at large scale might be cost prohibitive. So there may be some opportunities maybe to develop collective systems that could do this, that institutions are already required to do some tracking for research doctoral program placement, and so we certainly commend that, but it may be worth thinking about whether there's efficient ways to do this for other graduate programs. Student demand's a much kind of squishier topic. Most of the institutions we talked to seemed to not have very systematic approaches to student demand. The most common approach we heard was surveying students currently enrolled in a similar program to ask them if they would be interested in some new program. That's probably not terribly revealing, because you're starting with a sample of people who already kind of expressed an affinity for what you're doing. Many of the for-profit online delivery companies have more sophisticated market research functions that they apply when they make a business decision about whether to offer online programs. It's not entirely clear what to do here, but we think it's worth thinking about what are the options for measuring student demand, and what's the right balance between student demand and labor market demand. So if you've got a field where you really think there is strong student demand, but the labor market demand may not be so strong, do you go forward with that, or do you put that on hold? I told you we'd talk about multidisciplinary fields, new multidisciplinary fields. The institutions expressed quite a bit of enthusiasm for these fields. Interestingly, we talked to a small group of employers, and I don't want to claim this is too systematic, but employers we talked to were considerably less enthusiastic about these new multidisciplinary fields. And employers often said, we want certain skills. We don't necessarily need them to have a degree, a graduate degree specifically in some named field, as long as they can demonstrate that they've acquired these skills. And that geographic information science was a good example. And employers said there's many other ways we could get talent who have been trained, but they don't necessarily need these degrees. So we would urge a little bit of caution in thinking about these multidisciplinary fields, and in particular, requiring institutions to show that the program in general is needed in the economy. it's often not such a burden to show that the institution has capacity to deliver the field, because the capacity is usually built on existing departments that have already developed capacity in the related subjects. We also, I think, urge that the changes in professional standards be reflected in approval process. Texas has typically been a little slow to accept some of these changes. So, for instance, the DNP, Doctor of Nursing Practice, and the Doctorate for Physical Therapy. And I think we recognize that there's a concern about cost growth. We don't want to just expand credit hours and degrees and so forth and say, well, now it's going to cost you more to get into this profession. But I think there's a certain point at which, if that's what the marketplace is saying that employers want, then the employers are just not going to be happy if the institutions can't deliver that. I talked briefly about the low number of domestic students going into science and engineering programs, particularly research graduate programs. One of the reasons we heard for this is that the job market for engineers with a bachelor's degree is quite strong. And so domestic students may not see a large financial benefit to continuing on to graduate education when they can get a good paying job. We do think that the institutions and the systems can do more to expose undergraduates to opportunities in graduate education, in science and engineering, to strengthen the pipeline, to potentially have more institutional cooperation. Visited one institution that is undergraduate focused, and the president told us, I don't want to make this into a research university. I think we have a good mission here, but I want to expose the undergraduates to opportunities that they can go on to elsewhere in graduate education in a wide variety of fields. And it's important for us to build relationships across institutions and with our faculty so that the undergraduates understand that there's more to the higher education world than what we have here on our campus. One of the reasons also that we heard that domestic students are reluctant to go in is that the graduate student stipends that might be perfectly acceptable to a student coming from overseas who's kind of desperate to come to America and get into the American higher education and ultimately labor market system. Those stipends just may not be very attractive to domestic students. And so we would encourage you to think about whether the state or potentially private funders could offer supplementary stipends aimed at domestic students, which might provide a signal and an incentive to those students that it's worthwhile to proceed to graduate education, particularly research-focused graduate education. One of the things that we did here is that the domestic students are a good target for mid-career master's degrees. So they may work for a while, and they actually may be very well served by some of these online programs once they become established in their careers. We also looked at funding of graduate education. We asked the institutional leadership about the formula funding, the formula that's used. There's no real interest in revisiting the formula. Institutions recognize that it's not a perfect system, but they, by and large, said that we ought to leave it as it is. The one thing that we do think you might want to consider is it may be worthwhile to separate out the online from face-to-face delivery of master's and professional programs, because it could be that the formula is providing some, kind of inadvertent financial incentive to institutions to grow these large-scale online programs if they think, okay, well, that's going to bring in a bunch of formula funding. And in fact, if it's true that the cost of delivering those programs is much lower than face-to-face, especially when they reach large scale, then, kind of separating them, using the same formula approach, but separating them would eliminate that inadvertent incentive. As I told you, the sort of last topic is the proposal development and review process. We heard that the typical proposal takes about a year to go through the campus process, starting from faculty and department through the head of the institution. And then if it requires a full coordinating board review, probably another year for system level and coordinating board review. We also heard relatively few institutions that conducted an early pre-proposal review, and we think that's a missed opportunity. We heard stories of proposals that had spent all this time in development, and then when they finally got up to the institutional leadership or to the institutional leadership, that they raised kind of fundamental questions. So we encourage institutions to do a kind of earlier check-in. Similarly, some institutions told us that they consulted informally with coordinating board staff while they were developing their proposal, and that they found that very valuable. But many of the institutions and departments we visited said they didn't do that, they didn't necessarily feel comfortable with that. And so we talked to the staff of the coordinating board. We think it would also be productive to have that informal consultation. And finally, one thing that could also be done is to provide more explicit guidance on the characteristics of successful proposals. So what is it that really makes for a solid proposal? There are a variety of processes for ongoing review. So we looked at the graduate program review process. We also looked at the low producing programs report. Some of you may know that the coordinating board no longer has specific authority to close low producing programs, but does produce an annual report of programs with low production rates, and that if a program appears on that report for 3 years in a row, the institution's required to make a response about whether they want to keep the program. If they want to keep it, are they going to take any actions to increase enrollment? One of the strategies that institutions told us they follow is consolidating small programs. So to take related programs that are low producing and put them together into a larger program. Some of that seems productive because it's useful to have a kind of critical mass of students and faculty in a program. But some of that appeared to us just to be cosmetic. They just say, okay, well, we had these 4 programs. They were all low producing. We're going to put them under some broader degree title, but we're not really going to change the course sequences or the faculty who are involved or the students. And so that is probably not productive. There might be justification to maintain small programs in some fields, and the process does not require that the institutions have to close low producing programs, but they do need to provide either an action plan or at a minimum, a justification to say, okay, well, we know this is a small program, but maybe it's the only doctoral program in that field in the state of Texas, and so we don't necessarily want to get rid of it or something like that.
Charles, I'm sorry to interrupt with a bit of housekeeping, but we need to pay the caterers when they arrive at 11 o'clock.
All right.
So if you haven't already put your $10 in your envelope, please do so now so we can go ahead and pick that up.
Good.
Sorry for the digression.
That's all right. That was my last slide, so I am ready to transition to discussion time.
While the money's being collected for lunch, I wanted to open it up to the group for questions on the current presentation or any aspect of the report that you all read. I guess I'll be glad to start, and I wanted to offer maybe a comment. It's a more broader comment, and I think it's related to Mark's earlier comment. What this study appears to do is identify the need, that there is a justifiable need on the basis of competitiveness, on the basis of enhancing the state's position from an economic perspective. To what extent does your study offer guidance on gauging capacity, or what type of investment is actually going to be needed to ensure that there's sufficient capacity to grow annual program graduation or number of degrees, rather, by 80%? Does the study offer any guidance, or do you envision that the next step is to address that?
That's a good question. Yeah, we really did not try to address that. We do present some data on the research funding that the legislature provided in the last biennium. Yeah, it's tough to, I think, do those estimates at a statewide level. It really, because a lot of it's going to depend on the capacity the institutions have. And one of the things that we really don't know is what is the current unused or untapped capacity at institutions. So there may be institutions that have a capacity. We did ask in our case studies, we did ask institutions if they could grow the programs that we were talking about, and if so, what resources they would need to do it. But it's a little bit anecdotal, I think, to base a broader statewide strategy.
One thought is to maybe, for us all, I suppose, is to gauge or estimate what amount or what percentage of our doctoral programs require really heavy extramural non-state funding source in order to make the program successful. In the biomedical sciences, the area that I represent, that's a very significant number. So therefore, we have to be cognizant of how NIH is doing, for example. If NIH pay lines are in the single digits, it's going to be very difficult to grow biomedical programs when we rely so heavily on that type of funding. But I think I leave that sort of as an open-ended comment that we all probably have to think about that, and maybe that's some of the guidance that we can offer down the road to this group or others.
Yes, and I just wanted to ask a clarification on a couple of things, if that's all right, Charles. The first thing is that you mentioned about those online programs with formula funding, and you said separate them out. Did you mean that they no longer are counted in when they're deciding formula funding, or they're counted in at a lower formula funding? What does it mean to separate them out?
What we suggested in the report is essentially adding a column that would distinguish online from face-to-face. So they would all get formula funding, but the cost pooling would be done separately. Because right now, for instance, the cost pooling that generates the formula weights is just done by broad field and degree level. So that's kind of what we're saying. And
so for thinking that this would be a lower formula funding for those online programs.
That's right, if that's in fact where the trend is, yeah.
The other question that I had is, at the beginning you talked about the program proposals being linked to the institution's strategic plan, but specifically the part that's added, because that's always been the case, but what was added is this idea that they'd have to show entire resources to be able to support a research program, and you mentioned policies and other kinds of resources. How would that be determined that the university as a whole has those? What kinds of things would they be looking at?
Well, I think that the first, the threshold question is whether research doctoral programs represent a clear strategic direction for the institution as a whole. We would not strongly favor the approval of isolated research doctoral programs at institutions that otherwise don't have that as a mission. It's not to say that there aren't some examples in the state where that's done successfully, but as a general model, we think that the state ought to try to concentrate research doctoral programs in institutions that are going in that direction as a whole. So for instance, we visited one institution that has a formal 5-year strategic planning process. and they invite they are an institution that's attempting to expand their research activity, and they invite the departments to propose research doctoral programs as part of the 5-year strategic planning cycle. They select a very limited number of them as part of the institution-wide strategic plan, and they do not allow any other department to put forward a research doctoral program during the 5-year lifetime of that strategic plan. So if somebody else didn't make the cut or didn't raise their hand, they need to wait until the next 5-year cycle and compete. And because what they said is, we want to make sure that we are providing good resources, good institutional support to these research doctoral programs, and the best way to do that for us is to have an institution-wide decision and commitment, and not sort of go program by program. And I thought that, I mean, that's not the only model that could be adopted, but to me, that was evidence that the institution had adopted a strategy that was supportive of increasing research doctoral programs, but increasing them in a kind of measured way, and with a great deal of support. I would think you want to see. I think the faculty teaching load policy is absolutely essential. What typically happens as institutions switch from a teaching focus to a research focus is faculty have been hired over a long period of time with teaching mission in mind, and typically with relatively high teaching loads commensurate with it. It is a massive mistake to lower teaching loads across the board for faculty who will not be research active. Unfortunately, common mistake, but a big mistake. It's a huge cost. What the institution needs to do is adopt a policy that gears teaching load to research activity so that they can hire research active faculty or encourage faculty who may not have been strongly research active to move in that direction and to have the appropriate incentives so they can have release time from courses. And so that's something that I would want to see if I were reading research doctoral program proposal from an institution that's not already, kind of at that emerging research level. Is I want to see that they have thought about how are they going to maintain course coverage from the faculty that they have while providing the flexibility to grow. The other thing I would want to see is in research doctoral programs is strong support for student stipends. Our sense from the case studies is that there's a huge difference between kind of the emerging research university group and the, sort of the next cluster of institutions that do have some doctoral programs, but often provide very limited support. And many institutions, a number of institutions in that group told us, well, they try to give $1,000 institutional scholarship to as many students as possible because that will waive the out-of-state tuition differential if the student is not a state resident. But $1,000 is not going to pay a lot of the costs, whereas at the research-intensive universities and the majority of the emerging research, much more common to provide a reasonably full graduate stipend, and that's also something I want to see.
So I know there are a number of questions, so I'm going to identify folks in sequence. Mark, and then Andrea, and then Greg.
Thank you, Sonny. Charles, I really appreciate your hearing us last time, and I know there were some issues that we had about the data presentation, so I really appreciate that. And so I'm optimistic that the feedback that we provide today can be incorporated before you put together the final draft for distribution for public comment. I just want to come back to the point I made before about impact, and what I sense is I look at the logic model, and I just want, this is just a point of discussion. I understand that certainly the state of Texas invests through formula funding, and certainly the students that pay tuition, and so there is that state as a major stakeholder, but I'm just wondering if the lens is too narrow when you look at the impact. If the impact is only on increasing the economic competitiveness of Texas, is that really the end point that we want to be looking at? For a variety of reasons. One is I would hope that we do research in our universities that have regional, state, national, and global importance. And so I think our footprint should extend beyond the boundaries of the state of Texas. And having said that, I think that means that we need to make, and we should take a look at where we think our demand is in terms of our students. Should our scope of demand be confined to the boundaries of the state of Texas? And so I come back to my original comment about the economic projection, or the job projections that you made. And the reasons why it's especially counterintuitive, even if you look at just Texas itself, the increase in research expenditures alone during the last 10 years has created a tremendous number of jobs in the technology sector. And so, the point I made last time is, and I think is still underestimated here, is what is the universities, especially the research universities, are economic engines for the state of Texas. And I think we cannot underestimate the importance and the value of that to the economy of the state and of the nation. I think that I'm very concerned about that job outlook, because again, as I look forward to where we want to take the economy, I think we'd be restricting ourselves if we only grow graduate programs in those areas. And having said that, I want to come back to the comments you made about multidisciplinary programs. And I know my colleagues, in my most heretical moment, I've said we should really disband all disciplinary programs, because reports from NSF, NIH, and a whole host of other people say we really should have interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary programs. And so I'm concerned about a recommendation that would sort of restrict the development of them and say, oh, let's take a look at our disciplinary programs, because quite frankly, we can't say what the workforce says about the demand for interdisciplinary programs.
Thanks. All good points. We'll try to do our best. I think just on the last one, I think that multidisciplinary research programs are essential. I'm not as persuaded that multidisciplinary degree programs are so essential. I think there certainly are arguments, but I've come away from this study appreciating the role of the traditional disciplines in quality assurance, in faculty development and incentives, and I'm worried that, I think what some of the employers said is they're worried that these multidisciplinary degree programs aren't anchored enough in any one area that they have confidence in what's going on. So I think that's the tension.
Going back to the online degrees, when I read the report, I read this as part of a concern for the quality of the programs that are delivered online, particularly by third-party providers. Now, if the formula funding for online programs is going to be reduced, is this just not going to be more of an incentive for institutions who otherwise have not used third-party providers to go to third-party providers, because with their traditional staff on campus, they would no longer be able to afford to have these online programs?
We'll think about that. Yeah, it's a good point.
And in fact, actually, I was going to make much the same point. I know you're not recognizing the specific policy on formula funding. You're just talking about the issues that face it. But following up on both Andrea's and Candy's point, many of all of our online programs at Texas Southern organically grew out of our programs, and they are managed and run in-house. And, a significant change to formula funding that would reduce the amount of formula funding for our types of programs would significantly impact our ability to do exactly what you've identified as one of the most important things online programs do, which is reach mid-career professionals and give them a new set of credentials credentials and skills that they need to advance. So my suggestion would be is that it's an important point to consider, the role of third-party providers, how the state interacts with them, but that there would need to be some consideration to, programs that are organic to the institution and to its mission.
Okay. Can I ask, though, if you've got a better suggestion to manage the issue?
Well, I think it's just, the better suggestion would be just not to try and do a one-size-fits-all for this. And that maybe, it might be appropriate to make a distinction between someone who's using the third-party model versus someone who's not. Maybe there's something more sophisticated than that,
I'll add to that comment. I'm not convinced your statement is correct that online programs are generally less expensive. In fact, my experience is they're more expensive. And I think would suggest you might be going in the wrong direction, saying we're going to give you less formula funding for them. I'm not buying into that notion.
Get back in some sense, I think, to Sonny's comment about capacity. No matter how I cut the numbers, if you use research and development, it is on. If you look at federal R&D numbers as any kind of measure, Texas produces graduate degrees for half the dollars California does. If you just look at how many we produce, how much R&D. And so the idea that we're going to expand degree production without a substantial investment of dollars, I think is absurd. We're already doing it as cheap as we can. And your point, I've said this last time, but I'll say it again. The fact that R&D dollars are not expanding, for every dollar we try to gain, we have to take it away from someone else. And that suggests that we have to be hyper-competitive. But trying to expand degree production without a substantial investment in funds from somewhere, I think is just downright silly, because we're already at half the cost compared to California. And I just don't see how you do it.
So I wanted to maybe go back to the conversation about the feedback from employers. I think that a lot of the national conversation is that employers are saying that potentially students are too over-specialized and that we need to focus a lot on transferable skills and what we are giving them in the graduate programs. And so I guess I don't necessarily see anything reflective of that. And then also the point about focusing then maybe on the disciplinary versus the multidisciplinary. I think a lot of times from at least what I've heard nationally is the employers are not talking a lot about the disciplinary versus or the multidisciplinary, but also more so about the fact that given that the job that many of the graduates of today, will actually have or not even there, you really want them to be able to actually reinvent themselves over and over again to be able to shift, from, job to job. Some people are saying from project to project. So I think somehow that maybe needs to be reflected in that in terms of graduate education being able to train the students for, whatever the careers look like in the future is important. And I think resources are going to be needed for the universities to be able to provide those transferable skills outside of maybe what we're getting.
I'd like to go back to the point made by Mark earlier on the whole notion of projected increases in graduate degree demand. When you were looking at this data, Charles, did you look at Anthony Carnevale's work on education and the workforce, the work he has done at Georgetown? How did that sync with what you found in Texas? Because he does, of course, by state as well.
Yeah, we have looked at their work, and they do show, they show sort of broadly increasing demand for higher levels of education. But most of what they've done doesn't get down to sort of the field-specific level. We also look in the report, I didn't show it on the slides, we also have some charts in the report that show the graduate attainment rate in the population in Texas versus the other states. And Texas's graduate attainment rate has increased over the last decade by a pretty good amount. It's still a little lower than some of the other states. And I would maybe speculate that the composition of the population in Texas is going to present a challenge to continued increases in that graduate attainment rate, because you've got a population, a growing population, but the population segments that are growing are in groups and communities that have traditionally participated less in post-secondary education. And so you're going to be facing some challenges, I think, to maintain the level of attainment that you've got, much less to increase it. So I think that the result of that is that you import skilled workers from other states. Because when we measure the attainment of the Texas population, that doesn't mean that they earned those degrees in Texas. It just means they were here at the time when we counted them.
Do you see those challenges different from California? Are they not similar in their shifts as well?
The population in California is not growing that strongly anymore. So I think that the challenge is bigger in Texas than it is in California. On the other hand, the institutions, public institutions in California aren't growing either. So the capability to respond may actually be less in California compared to Texas.
Go ahead.
Well, just to follow up on your response to Joanne, when you talk about the increase in the population that we're actually seeing in our graduate programs and who's actually attaining those degrees, and if we look at that from a demographic perspective, then we know that a number of our students really aren't able to come in, and that's pretty much linked to what Dean was actually saying because of the funding aspect. And so I didn't see much of that in the report, and I hope that that's really going to be addressed, because that's really something we really need to look at, not just for the expansion of new programs, but even with our current programs and being able to grow populations in those programs. As you said, the $1,000 is for me, unique to have that, and that allowing people to have in-state. But when we look at least at my institution, who's coming in for those graduate degrees, they're taking longer because we aren't providing the level of funding they actually need. So then they're working even more than just saying the working professional with families. And the stipends that we're providing are just not adequate. And then trying to pull people from other states to come to Texas for our graduate degrees, we can't be competitive with the amount of funding we're providing. That level is just not enough. So I hope that that's something that's going to be addressed to help us start looking at how do we address this across the various systems and definitely across the institution, looking at it not just at the formula funding, but other aspects as well.
Piggybacking on that, was there a look at how other states are doing this? Because I think one of the problems we run into is that many other states waive tuition, and we're consistently at a lack of being able to compete because of that, and that gets back to the payments, because if these other states are all waiving tuition and Texas can't, then that means we're having to provide larger and larger stipends to do basically what everybody else does to get the good students.
Can I just add that then that's also why we're losing out some of our top students who are right here in Texas, that they're going to other states for those graduate degrees because they have this tuition waivers and all these other levels of support that we just can't compete with.
I have a question related to the overall premise of enhancing the economic impact and as well as the reputational impact of the proposal. And I wanted to ask you or any member of the coordinating board of the group as a whole, actually, about this philosophical perspective, and that is there any disadvantage to meet this economic boost that the state of Texas is looking for, of actually recruiting individuals who are trained in other states into our state. How does that factor into this growth projection? So if we're talking about growing our population, number of degrees awarded by 80% annually, to what extent is that number tempered by the state's competitiveness in recruiting people who've been trained at other states into our state on the basis of something that, frankly, I don't think any one of us can control, and that is the economic incentives that the state of Texas provides companies to come in and set up shop here? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, I think it's a very good point. And a lot of the skilled workforce in Texas does come from other states. In fact, that was a question that was raised. This question was raised by one of our peer reviewers. Said, well, why shouldn't Texas just keep taking advantage of other states that are willing to produce these graduates? We didn't talk to a huge number of employers, but the employers that we did talk to said, they preferred it was easier to recruit good employees who were already in the state. It was easier to keep them, and that certainly the spillovers from the research that's done at the universities are not going to accrue to the state of Texas if that research is only being done in New York or California. So yeah, I don't have a wonderful answer to this point, because clearly we have a national labor market, and it's true that the higher the level of the degree, the more mobile people tend to be and the wider their job searches. So it's sort of logical to think that at the highest levels, it's really a national market. We'll try to give this a little more thought and see if we could say more about it.
We'll have just a couple of more questions, and then I want to make sure I also, at the end of that, represent someone that's not here but was at the ATGS meeting who had a related question.
So the report makes two recommendations that in principle I think are good, very good ideas, and that is to track the job placements of graduate students, and also to provide funding for domestic students in the science fields. However, because of these tentative wording regarding where that funding ought to come from in the report, I am very concerned that this is going to be an unfunded mandate. And so I would strongly encourage you to formulate that additional funding is absolutely essential if universities are going to have to do these items, because otherwise we simply wouldn't be.
Well, I guess at a minimum, we could more clearly reflect that in those two recommendations. So,
please.
Charles, I'm just sort of curious, if you look at the R&D obligations, you've got a nice figure for that comparing Texas to California. And 2013, it looks like Texas was at about 1.25 billion, whereas California was about 3.75 billion. But if you look at the total R&D expenditures reported by the institutions, California adds up to about 7.5 billion. Texas adds up to about 3.5 billion. So in terms of gap, there's a substantial gap in federal R&D, but there's a much larger gap in absolute dollars, apparently. And it would also suggest a much larger gap in investment placed in R&D from other sources. That's a $4 billion gap between California and Texas when you just add up the R&D expenditures. And I put the health institutions with all the rest of the academic, and just do a gross total. Because as Sonny pointed out, a lot of the health institutions, NIH money, that should have shown up in the federal R&D. So there's a very large dollar difference that's being invested in graduate education in California from other sources that is not being invested here. And if you normalize to degrees produced, it's not quite as big a gap, but it's still a substantial gap.
Sonny, can I make a quick comment?
Please.
Charles, whenever you make recommendations, sometimes those are interpreted and implemented in kind of stringent ways. And I'm looking at the recommendation that we should build our graduate enterprise, continue that growth off of moderate and high categories of institutions, research producing institutions. And I would just want us to be careful, because I know that in the scope of your conversations, I think you were able to have conversations with one master serving institution, and those regional kinds of institutions, master servings, are so vastly different that a conversation with one, and I know you know that, doesn't capture what's happening across the board there. And there is good opportunity to advance graduate to produce graduates in those master's institutions. And so I would just want to be really careful that a recommendation doesn't somehow close the door to some of those other institutions.
It's an important point. I wanted to represent one member of the ATGS group who wanted a little more clarification on, to the extent that demographics were a covariate in the analysis. I think we touched on this a little bit already, and as you pointed out, rightfully so, that the shift in demographics is evident perhaps very strongly in Texas compared to another state like California. To what extent did that play a role in the recommendations?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, we did not, I don't think we addressed the state demographics to the extent we could, and maybe we'll give that some more thought and potentially add something in the final report. We also sort of really, we really touched very lightly on the issue of underrepresented groups in graduate education. Some of the policies that we suggest about improving the pipeline for domestic students in general have the potential to also, in particular, increase the flow of underrepresented minorities. Obviously, in a logical sense, the first is really a prerequisite for the second. If you don't have domestic students going in, then you certainly don't, in particular, have underrepresented minority groups.
Other thoughts?
Were there anything else, Sonny, was there anything else notable that came up in the ATGS that we haven't talked about today with this group?
That was one that I wrote down specifically because we had a little bit of a sidebar after my presentation. But I know there are several people in the room who were at there, and I asked for their assistance in identifying any other issues that we haven't covered yet. Yeah, Rex. I'm always glad to see another fellow technoplankton, so.
Yes. In many respects, I'm very much a Luddite. Except when it comes to stereo equipment and fast cars. But outside of those two things, I'm very much a Luddite. Just a couple of comments. One of the comment about the extent to which outside degrees are counted and that kind of thing. Keep in mind that the state's overall higher education strategic plan, 60 by 30, has two goals that revolve around graduation and completion. And then, of course, enrollment, and behind that, and master's degrees are included in this, in the 60 by 30 goals. And one of them talks about, so what is Texas itself going to do and that is by 2030, you're supposed to have 550,000 credentials per year, of which master's degrees will be counted in that 550,000. That's from Texas institutions alone. But then the 60 by 30 itself, which is that by 2030, 60% of all Texans ages 25 to 34 will have some kind of post-secondary credential, which again includes master's degrees. That includes anybody we can steal from other states as well.
Those engineers from Florida.
Yeah, those guys, exactly. And so, we, there are places where we sort of take account of this, and then there are other places where we don't. But on the other hand, part of this, and not just with graduate education, but also undergraduate education, is there's also that sense of taking care of our own, so to speak, as well, and trying to make sure that there's opportunities for Texans, ever how you want to describe those. And I don't know exactly how you balance that out in some ways. And of course, a part of it is it's a great unknown. But it is true, on the other hand, that a lot of business and industry like to recruit from institutions in the place where they are, because they know that it's actually much more likely that people will stay there. I have a good friend of mine whose son is now he went to A&M, got an engineering degree. He's now in New York. And, part of going to New York is that long-term strategy of being with the company and then convincing them at some point that they should bring him back to Texas. So, and that plays out with a lot of different people in a lot of different places and a lot of different degrees. The other is it goes back to touch on a little bit of the issue about unfunded mandates, of which we're all very aware of. I mean, a lot of the things that we're asked to do come with no funding attached to them either. And so we're acutely aware of unfunded mandates as well. And I think that is something to be very leery of, by the way. But I just want to remind you that this report goes to the coordinating board, but this is not a legislative report. So it goes to the coordinating board, and probably the major impetus behind asking for this kind of study in the first place was to inform the graduate education strategic plan that the coordinating board wishes to create, with an awful lot of your input and guidance. So there's still much to be done with this.
I would like to maybe ask, and maybe it's available and I just haven't seen it, but I think one thing I would welcome is to know what kinds of initiatives are in place by the state to actually ensure that the market demand persists for the graduates that are being trained in our programs. Because we're talking about, the example you gave, people getting trained, going to another place, and then trying to incentivize their return. But even from the standpoint of just, cherry picking or just recruiting en masse talent from other states that have been trained in other states, is there a parallel process going on, initiated by the governor's office or whatever, where they're trying to enhance the number of companies that come in certain sectors and that kind of stuff? And maybe even if it's just for information purposes, then we have an idea about whether the efforts that we're applying or may be asked to implement are going to match some capacity that's also growing. Because if the capacity isn't going to grow and we're just going to increase the number of graduates, we're going to have the same kind of discussions that the NIH is having with us in the biomedical area, that you can't clone yourself anymore. You can't make PhDs who are destined to go into academia. The market just can't sustain that. So they've defined success of these programs differently, and that's another theme that I would encourage gets considered. We must define the success of these programs in terms of job placement in a much more broad sense than we've traditionally done. Because if we don't do that, then we're setting ourselves up to fail, I think. So I'll invite any final comments. Dimitri?
So how do we compare in terms of pipelines of students who go to graduate school to California and New York? You mentioned we need to try to bring more domestic, and I'm from engineering, I know how difficult it is, but how do we compare to other states?
We actually did not look at that, but we'll try to take a look and see what the data tells us on that.
That would be interesting to know.
We'll have one last question from Karen.
So my question is, when we look at the projected growth in degree production, that the state's strategic plan calls for, I imagine that we have to have the people in the universities who will teach that. And so did that at all come up in something that you investigated, and where the growth might be? What kind of demand there will be to in the community colleges and the universities and things like that to essentially serve that degree production that we're looking for? And so, yeah. Those are graduate degrees, I would think.
Yeah, and we do have that in the labor market, at least in a sort of general way. And the table in the appendix shows the top faculty disciplines that are expected. That's based on the TWC's projection. It's not explicitly based on the 60 by 30 plan, which is going to lead to a big demand for hiring faculty. Yeah, that's probably, it would be a good point to at least, I don't know if we can put numbers around it, but
at least
qualitatively.
mention,
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to comment, Sonny, about that. I mean, I think that's certainly something that as we work on developing an overall graduate education strategic plan, that becomes a significant piece of that. Because it does it tends to be glossed over a little bit.
Great. Great discussion, and I want to please join me in thanking Dr. Goldman for coming here and explaining in greater detail the reports. Thank you for your time. Yeah. So without any further delay, we'll go to the next item that stands between us and lunch. No pressure.
Great, thank you, Sonny. Okay, so there's a few things I wanted to go over to give you a coordinating board update and let you know what we've been up to. If you've been paying attention to the cause committee and board agenda, you'll see that we've got a couple of rules revisions coming up. We want to revise the rules in Chapter 5B. Those are the rules considering preliminary planning authority. And then in December, cause, January board meeting, we're also considering some smaller changes to the 5C rules, and those are about the criteria for bachelor's and master's degrees. So if you'll excuse me for just a second, I'll throw those up on the screen so that you can see what I'm talking about, and I'll go over them with you briefly.
Well, this one's working. Actually, I figured out how to turn it on.
Thank you. Whoa. So this first set of rules, Chapter 5B, these are the rules that were considered and just heard at the Wednesday cause meeting. They'll be coming to the October board meeting. These are the planning notification rules. In particular, I want to draw your attention to, first, the definition we've made a modification here. Formal notification from an institution that planning has begun for a proposal for a new degree program. The next significant change here is in this definition of planning. An institution is considered by the board to be planning for a new degree if it takes any action that leads to the preparation of a proposal for a new program, including hiring personnel, including consultants and planning deans, leasing and/or purchasing real estate, building facilities, and/or developing curriculum. Our feeling as staff, based on comments made by the board, was that the board was feeling frustrated because it felt it wasn't getting the kind of early notification about planning for degree programs that it wanted. In particular, for some of the large dollar items, in particular doctoral degrees, in particular professional doctoral degrees that have significant cost tags associated with them. They might require building new facilities, new labs, hiring some rather expensive faculty and personnel, a dean for a college or a school. And our sort of staff interpretation of the comments that the board made was that the board felt they weren't getting notified early enough, in the sense that by the time institutions were coming to the board and telling them about their plans, the institutions had already spent big sums of money. And that put the board in the position of, well, now you've already spent all this money, it's kind of late for us to be making recommendations or actions about this because now it's sort of progressed pretty far down the road. So in these rules revisions, we wanted to try to capture that by putting these definitions forward and making it clear that you should be notifying the board before you've completed the planning process. In other words, before you've taken a whole bunch of expensive, costly steps in furtherance of the potential degree proposal. Okay, so this is then about the process for submitting these planning notifications. And the next significant change is in 5.24a. When submitting a planning notification to add a degree program to the institution's program inventory, an institution of higher education may be requested to address the board at a regularly scheduled meeting to describe how the institution believes the potential program contributes to the efficient and effective diffusion of education throughout the state, while avoiding costly duplication in program offerings, faculties, and physical plants. An institution shall submit written information to the board, including the title of the potential proposed program, level, classification of instructional program code, anticipated date of proposal submission, and provide a brief description of the proposed program. Planning notification must occur prior to an institution beginning planning for or submitting a proposal for a new degree program that requires board approval. And so notice this is conditional language, not that every degree program is necessarily going to be requested to make a statement before the board, but again, the staff feeling was that the board wanted the option of being able to hear more about your plans as you begin making them. The next significant change here now is in 5.243. And this specifically concerns those professional programs. This is the segment of doctoral proposals that seem to be of most concern to the board during their discussions. Planning notification must be submitted at least 1 year prior to the submission of a proposal to offer the degree if the proposed program would be a program leading to the award of a professional degree, as defined in Texas Education Code, and it includes the programs you would expect to see: Doctor of Medicine, Doctor of Osteopathy, Doctor of Dental Surgery, DVM, JD, Bachelor of Laws, so forth. You scroll down, that is the overview of the changes we've made here in this planning notification. Do we have any comments about that before we move on? Maybe we should take them this sort of topic by topic. Any questions about this? Again, this has already gone to the cause committee here on Wednesday. This will be heard and considered by the full board at their October meeting. Yes, sir.
So are these just notifications, or there'll be expected some response from the CB? I mean,
Oh, I see. So, so is this more like a proposal that something may be approved or denied? Is that?
yes, I guess. Will the universities have to expect something from you? Can you reject them from considering?
I'll let Rex address that. I think he has a better sense of that than I.
So I think the short answer to that is no, because the planning notification piece itself asks you to tell us in advance that you're planning to do something, or and I'll admit that this whole notion of when does planning begin is somewhat of a tricky business, and we've had a lot of internal discussion about that, and so does planning begin when when one of your department chairs comes to you and says, hey, I got this great idea for a program? Well, probably not. I mean, planning probably really begins when, you take that further up the line, and there's a cadre of people in the institution who decide, yeah, this may really be a good idea. Let's do this, and then what is it going to take to get there? So, but in the sense of this going to the board and then the board being able to approve or disapprove, no, because they can't do that with simply planning notification. But I think, as James said, the concern that the board has about this is that we sometimes get proposals for programs well after. In fact, we have some cases of where we've never received planning notification of proposals. We have other instances of where we received planning notification well after the proposal was submitted. And with particularly high dollar items, and where the institutions have made considerable investments in facilities or equipment or whatever, then there's oftentimes a lot of pressure brought to bear to approve the program, because after all, regardless of whether anybody needs it or not, we've invested a lot of money in this thing. And, you need to approve it just because we've done that. And so, and particularly with the programs that are enunciated in the, or delineated in the rule itself, most of those things require, significant investments in facilities, equipment, and faculty, and so forth to make it work. A medical school is a very expensive affair, for example. So I think part of the concern is that somehow the board has the opportunity to at least provide some insight into whether they think a proposal should even be considered or not. But that in and of itself is not an approval or disapproval. The board could say, for example, we really don't think this is a good idea. The institution could still pursue it anyway, and then you have to see what happens at that juncture.
Just to follow up with that, Rex, and I think Dimitri's question is this: when we send the notification, should we expect something back from you before we proceed? Because if indeed.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, if it sort of falls into this category, then yes. In that sense, then yes, you should expect something back. And it really wouldn't come from the board necessarily as much as it would come from staff about whether we intend to take this forward or not. In the vast majority of cases, I think the answer would be no, we don't. Thank you for your planning notification, and we look forward to your proposal, kind of thing. But there may be some, I would think, fairly rare instances. And in that sense, yes, you could and should expect something back from us. Thank you.
So is there some rationale in how you determine the 1 year? In the last bullet where it's 1 year in advance of, how was that determined?
That doesn't make the process more nimble.
I'll make an attempt to address that. I think it goes back to, if you look at those programs that are delineated there, most of them require not just in a significant amount of planning but they also require a significant amount of dealing with other entities and bodies and that kind of thing. And so in some sense, the year is somewhat arbitrary, but on the other hand, there was a lot of consideration given to, just how much time and effort is involved in this. And how far down the road do you want an institution to get in expending a lot of money before they know what the thoughts of the board are on this? And so I think, again, a part of this is an attempt by the board to be able to give something well ahead of that expense of a lot of resources to say, yeah, we think this is a good idea, and no, this is a bad idea. So.
I guess, sorry, go ahead.
Record.
Does the 1-year time frame apply to research doctorates?
The 1 year applies to those programs that are enunciated, yeah. Those that are, no, just those 5 that are, the 1 year only applies to those 5 or 6, the ones that are up there. Yeah.
Okay, I think, yes, we have a second working microphone. Hooray. Any other questions about these proposed rules? Okay. All right, let's move on to the rules that were going to be up for consideration at the December cause meeting. This is about the criteria, essentially. So what we've done here is some cleanup. We've changed a bunch of shall statements to must. So institutions must request new bachelor's and master's programs using the most recent version of the appropriate request form. Clarification in 544A2 about the review for completeness. This is that initial 5-day review that staff now conduct. So, if you get a master's or doctoral program back quickly, right after you've submitted it, chances are that we staff have reviewed it and found one or more important elements are missing. And because of the way that our statute is now structured, that's actually a big deal. We're required to review for completeness and let you know right away, within 5 working days, whether or not that proposal you just submitted was complete or not. So this is basically making clear that we're reviewing for completeness at this point. We're not yet evaluating the proposal overall. That's going to come just after this part of the process. Let's see, another shall to will there in number 4. We've done a number of cleanup because we still had the old workforce, academic affairs, and research name in there, so we cleared that out and substituted that with our current name, academic quality and workforce. We make it clear that you're adding the program to the institution's program inventory, just again for clarity. And again, the institution must submit a proposal using the most recent version of the full request form. Occasionally, we have issues, and I think this is because of your own institutional processes, right? It takes a year or so, sometimes more, for it to clear your campus. Then it might take another half a year or a year for it to clear, your system office and your board of regents. And so then by the time it gets to us, it's 1.5 years, 2 years old, and sometimes that means it's printed on an outdated form. That means that it's probably not complete because there's probably some additional things that we're asking for on this version of the form that weren't even there on the previous version of the form. So we want to try to make it clear that each time we revise the forms, we send out a memo, and usually we say after X date, which is usually the date of the memo, you have to submit using this new form because we've basically discarded the old form. So we just want to put that into the rules and make that clear to you. Items here in 5 are really just a few clarifications: semester credit hour limit rather than just hour limit, board staff rather than just the coordinating board. The same here in number 6, we've got a clear up of the name, a shall to a must, institutions of higher education, just as a clarification. There at the bottom, no new program will be approved until all objections are resolved. Well, we wanted to make that change because we're not in charge of implementation. You are. But we are in charge of approval, and that's where our control is. Same here for number 8, the most recent version of the standard doctoral program form, some other wills and shalls. And then we get to 2 and 3. We've got here some other requests for the most recent version of the form, public institutions of higher education, and some other cleanup. But you can see that a lot of this is cleanup in language, trying to make the language a little more clear, a little more current, make sure the imperative to use the most recent versions of our form is there, but not nearly as much substantive change as you just saw in the planning notification rules. Any questions about this set of rules? Yes, sir. Wes?
Existing programs that are considering major structural changes, including even a name change perchance, would this be part of the process now?
Okay. So revising an existing program, and when have you revised that existing program so much that now it's really a new program? Honestly, that's a judgment call. There's no single set of criteria that covers all the different possible situations at the certificate, bachelor's, master's, and doctoral level. What we tend to look at is sort of just a preponderance of evidence. You know, the more changes you make and the more substantive those changes are, the more likely it is that you're creating a new program. So, you know, if you just go through and you change a title, probably not a new program. But now if you go through and you change a title and you change the zip code and you're changing some of the curriculum, now you're probably changing the workforce and employment outcomes for the students. Now we're a lot more likely to be looking at a new program. Honestly, that's how we take these. Each of these requests that you make for a change to an existing program, we weigh it out. And we ask ourselves this question: are the sum total of the changes sufficient to warrant viewing this as a new program or not? That's an excellent question. And it's something we continue to struggle with because we want to approach this fairly, we want to approach this rationally, but it's not an easy question to answer. Any others? Okay. Let's move on a little further. Okay, so both to the certificate and the full form. So this is a certification form for bachelor's and master's degrees. This is the one that you use when your bachelor's and master's degree hits all the right notes. It meets all of our standards and criteria, and so basically you can just provide us with a statement of assurances where your provost, someone signing off for your board of regents, basically says, hey, this is going to be a good quality program. We're adhering to all the board standards and criteria, so you ought to just go ahead and approve it. And most of the time, that's exactly what we do. This is the short form is designed for sort of the routine cases. What we've done is we've tried to combine this, we've gone through and combined this with our, basically our electronic or off-campus delivery form, right? Because in the past, you had to submit 2 separate forms. If you were going to propose not just a new program, but a new program that's going to be offered online or off your main campus site. What I've done is I've taken the elements of the online notification and built them into this new program form. So now if you are submitting a new program, a new bachelor's or master's degree that's going to be offered electronically or off campus, now you can just fill out the single form and give it to us. Now we're still in the process of revising this a little bit, so this isn't available online yet, but I would imagine within just a few more weeks we'll get this finalized and get this up on the website so that you can start using it, and when that happens, we'll send out a memo to let you know, so they won't take you by surprise. And this one is fairly short, just to scroll through it. This is just the basic information about the program. Here we've got the standards for the principles of good practice for academic degree and certificate programs and credit courses offered electronically. So basically this tells you, here's what I commit to adhering to. And then at the end, got a spot for your CAO or your president to sign off on it. Just as, and this is the old part of the form, that's just the academic standards part, that you said, yes, this new program, this bachelor's and master's program that I'm proposing is going to adhere to all the board standards, And here, I have, as the CEO, I'm signing off on it and signing off on it for the Board of Regents designee.
James, what about existing programs that you're taking totally online?
That has a separate form, and since that's not a new program, there's nothing to combine it with. We already have a separate form available for you if you're going to take an existing program and start offering it online or off your main campus.
Separate form.
Just real quickly, so this is what we call the full form. This is the form where the bachelor's or master's program that you're proposing does not automatically fit all of those criteria. Perhaps it's in engineering, perhaps it's going to cost more than $2 million. And so here we ask you a lot more detailed information about the program. We ask you about the workforce need, the student demand, the enrollment projections, all the academic information about the curriculum, about the faculty, about facilities and equipment, accreditation and evaluation, costs and funding. Then, again, just like the other form here, we've added in the certification of compliance for programs to be offered online or off campus. You got a statement of the standards you're expected to adhere to, which I'm scrolling through now. And then there's a sign-off. Yes, we're going to adhere to all these standards when we offer this online or off of our main campus. Just as then there's also a signature page for all the things that come standard with a new bachelor's or master's program. You've got enough funds to cover it. Hey, I've notified all public institutions in a 50-mile radius, and here my CEO is signing off, and someone's also signing off for the Board of Regents to indicate Board of Regents approval. So those are the new forms that will be coming onto our website very soon, within just a few weeks, I would imagine. And those are the new rules that we're proposing either now or at the next upcoming board cycle. And that concludes my presentation of what's going on with the CB update.
Any questions for Dr. Goman? Okay, if not, thank you. The next all-important item is lunch. So we'll take a half an hour break and reconvene at 12:35.
Sure.
start up again. I'm going to pass the baton to Dr. Mickey.
Thank you very much. Just a word of welcome from the Higher Education Coordinating Board. We appreciate all of you coming in today. We know it's a lot of time and expense on your part, and we really do appreciate all the efforts that you're making on behalf of GEAC, and a special welcome to all of our new members. If there's anything that the new members for you, that anything that the coordinating board can do to help you with GEAC, we're always happy to help. Myself and Dr. James Goman are happy to answer any questions or give you any information you might need. A little bit of housekeeping announcements from the coordinating board side of things. Our former administrative assistant, Cindy Valdez, has taken a position with another agency. We were very sorry to see her go, but we're also very happy to welcome Alicia Amarillo as our new, is she here? She may be upstairs. So in the future, you'll be getting emails from Alicia and working closely with her, so we certainly appreciate all of her efforts in getting this meeting set up today and on our future meetings. Another little change is we'd like for you all to please keep your travel receipts from now on. We have to do an annual report to the Legislative Budget Board about the costs of GEAC to the state, and we really need you to keep an estimate of your travel expenses, especially those of you who fly in or stay in hotels. Just please keep a note, and at some point during the year, we'll ask you for your total over the last 12 months of what you've spent on GEAC. So please just start a file somewhere on your computer. And I don't think we need copies of your receipts, but we do need to have a running total. So we'd like you to keep tabs on that from now on. Also, my apologies to those of you today if you had any trouble at the airport or trouble getting in. This is like the first weekend of the Austin City Limits Festival, so I already heard that there's some crowded airports. The airport's just, full of hipsters, and, it's hard to make it through security. However, it's not as bad as the one time when we had the GEAC meeting. I think it was like 2 years ago when we had scheduled the meeting on the same day as the opening of the big Austin Formula 500 race, right? That was a nightmare. When we planned the meeting well enough in advance, who knew that was going to be the opening weekend? Well, I guess we could have known, but nobody bothered to look that up, and it was just a nightmare for people. There were 0 hotel rooms, and I don't know, it was a mess. So in the future, we'll try to do better about that. We'll get a copy of the Chronicle and look up what's going on in Austin the weekend of a GEAC meeting. When we were doing some scheduling, a conversation got started about whether or not a 10 a.m. start time, which we've traditionally done, is really helpful for people. Can you let me know, is 10 a.m. okay time to start? Is it too difficult for those of you who drive in from the Metroplex or the Gulf Coast? Is it possible to get airline flights for those of you who fly in to be here by 10? Is it a burden, or is this as good as any time for a GEAC meeting? We could meet from 12 to 4 instead of 10 to 2. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, well, that's good for us to know. Okay, thank you very much.
Actually, I think you're still on. I think you're doing the characteristics.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, I still have the microphone, I guess, since it's next. My agenda item is next on the characteristics of doctoral programs. Actually, I will turn this over to Dr. Goman, if that's okay, to give you a little background on where we are on the characteristics of doctoral programs. This is an issue that began with GEAC, and we've tried to keep GEAC informed and, in turn, be informed by GEAC on all things relating to the reporting that goes into the characteristics of doctoral programs. We've recently made some changes, both in the direction and the wording of the doctoral programs, and you'll see that in the 2 handouts that you have in front of you. First is a draft of our proposed revisions to the characteristics of doctoral programs, and then there's also the original, which was the 18 characteristics, if you'd like to compare them side by side. James?
Thank you, Alan. So in the beginning, these were the characteristics of Texas public doctoral programs. And somewhere along the way, people counted them up and noticed that there were 18 of them. And then it was christened the 18 characteristics of public doctoral programs. which I think we're probably going to go back and make a rule change, and I'd like to change it back. Because this committee, we take a lot of input from this committee, and I can easily see that we've reformulated them now, and they may, over the years, I hope, continue to be reformulated so that they're always current, and they're always meaningful, and they're always relevant. And so, being tied to a particular number is actually a little bit silly, or at least counterproductive. So when we make a rule change, that's one of the things I propose to change. Right now, our current rules, just to give you a background and what the requirement is, Rule 5.51, publishing of doctoral program data, says each public university and health-related institution with one or more doctoral programs on its program inventory shall collect and publish information on its website regarding 18 characteristics of doctoral education as approved by the board on a schedule determined by the commissioner. Each institution must develop and implement a plan for using the 18 characteristics for ongoing evaluation and quality improvement of each doctoral program. Now that goes back to the original deliberations wherein the characteristics were developed, right here with this committee. GIAC originally formulated these. It was GIAC discussions that led to the creation of this and of the creation of this policy. So if I go back and look at the rules from the 6th meeting of the Graduate Education Advisory Committee on May 5th, 2006, not many of us were on this committee at that time. But here we have recommendations from the doctoral study, and this is the doctoral study that GIAC itself conducted. It was a doctoral study that occurred about 2001, and it wasn't GIAC yet, but it was us working with groups of graduate deans and board staff working to develop an early study of doctoral education and what things should be done to improve it. And one of the recommendations was, hey, you board staff should continue working with graduate deans because they provide good input, and this will help over the years improve the quality of graduate education. So that led directly to the creation of GIAC. Then, having been created, one of the things that GIAC did was these characteristics, and the discussion included the recommendations developed from this committee were to identify key measures of quality and to collect those measures for dissemination to targeted audiences, i.e. the public, the coordinating board, and for institutional planning purposes. So who are the characteristics for? They're for you, they're for us staff, and they're for the general public. Some measures would be available to prospective students, some would be available to the CB to identify programs that were not as strong as they could be, and to have some mechanism for a response from the CB. Lastly, some measures would be used by the institutions themselves to take corrective action to remedy any deficiencies. The measures would not be used in any sort of ranking system or to replace an external review. The measures are not meant to be punitive. The task of the committee is to look at the proposed definitions CB staff have come up with and refine them. And that remains really the task today, and that remains the situation today, that these characteristics do not take the place of your external review, but they do get you headed in that direction. A lot of the items that you would need for your self-study are contained within the characteristics themselves. So that's a little bit of the background and the history of this, which has led us, so that led us to the 2008 iteration of the 18 characteristics, which were the first set approved. Once those were approved and in place, a year later, you started publishing that on your own website. And after that initial year of experience, you came back to us and you said, these are good, but they could be better. And there's some of the definitions that need some tweaking. They could fit better with what they're supposed to describe. That took place in 2010. So the current published iteration, not the draft that you have before you, but the current published iteration has not changed since 2010. And as I said earlier, we want this to be relevant, we want this to be meaningful, and we want this to be accurate in the sense of accurate descriptions of what you're doing with your doctoral programs. So it really is high time that we considered refining these a little further. And so one of the things that we've done was to try to split them into 3 groups. So if you look at the way it's set up now, rather than have and this is what we first considered, is having one set of characteristics for the research-based programs, and then another set of characteristics for the professional programs. And we had several meetings about this, and we discussed that, and you guys actually came up with some draft characteristics for the professional programs. And we took those into account, and we took a look at them, and in the end, we thought, well, wouldn't it be simpler and wouldn't it be better and clearer for everyone if we had a set of characteristics that apply to all the doctorates, and then two smaller subsets of characteristics, one of which would be just for the research and one of which would be just for the professional. That's how we've arrived at this iteration that you have now. And what we'd really like to hear from you is the definitions and the way we've constructed these. Could they be improved? Should they be improved? Is there anything in here that seems inaccurate or not a very good description of the way that your programs would or should perform?
I'd like to start, but I think, James, something tells me we've had this conversation before. The stumpers for me are when it asked on page 1, for example, for core faculty activities, and a related one on student publications presentations. So what I have seen is, in some cases, if a publication is co-authored, it's listed for every time, it's counted each time. Sometimes it's counted only by first author, and sometimes it's counted for a student and the faculty both, if they co-authored, right? So what obviously that does is sometimes it double and triple dips in some cases. So shouldn't there be some kind of a consistent measure? Because if some do it one way and others go only by first author, then clearly there's going to be a difference in pubs.
One of the ways that we've handled it, just as a basis for some additional discussion, is we actually put a qualifier. We say unduplicated publications, where we actually go through that list. So if you have two students, for example, who are on the same paper, and you don't go by student and then count that paper twice, but rather you go through the list and identify the duplications in your list, and then you omit it. And then by saying, so it counts as one. It's up to this group, I guess, to decide whether that's the best way to do it. I know that for certain training programs sponsored by the NIH, we are to report unduplicated publications. So at least that's one perspective, but I'd be interested to hear others.
What always bothers me about doing it that way is it discourages collaborative work. You have a project where two students make equal contributions, that is discouraged, and I think we're always trying to teach our students, at least in engineering, we're always trying to tell people you're supposed to work in teams. Right. It's not a solo activity anymore. So there's a trade-off there, and I'd hate to.
So let me respond to that. I guess that there should be, and I think that's a really meaningful feedback. And the way we've handled it is we do not discourage a student from being credited for that publication. So all students who participated in that publication get credit. So it doesn't detract from their ability. But how the institution as a whole reports publications, it would be, that was a single body of work that happened to be a product of a number of individuals. But if we were to count it multiple times based on the number of authors that happen to be students, we would be perhaps not stating the number of scholarly bodies of work that were in fact products of the research.
I certainly agree that there should be a definition, but I think, whenever you put a metric down, whether we like it or not, people, you optimize to a metric.
Dean,
it's natural tendency.
Is it also practice, though, that when there are multiple authors, they kind of rotate who gets first author? And so ultimately, one of them will have, no?
Certainly not in my field, and there's some other engineers and such around it. It just depends on how the work was done. But
We'll go with Greg, then Karen.
Well, I think we might be guilty of splitting hairs here. This is, as I understand James's introduction, this is not supposed to be a punitive, qualitative sort of situation, and this is just supposed to be a list of so that people who read it get an example. So, for example, I would think that given the purposes of it, it would be absolutely appropriate where you had faculty collaborating with students, that be listed in both the faculty and student, because you're reporting two different things there. And I would then say that if you're just listing it in faculty and student, it doesn't matter,
So sort of pretty much what Greg was saying, and then just to kind of elaborate a little more, I think to me, my understanding is, so some of this is also for prospective students to sort of, see. So the idea of understanding how many publications a student has, to me, is the value of this. This is not the data that we give to the federal agencies and stuff like that. And so I think even within the student category, if two students were on a publication and you counted it for both of them, I still think that's okay because they both have a publication. So I don't really see any harm in trying to double dip, and I think it would be very difficult to be consistent because across fields, there is really not, so we know in some there are 40 authors and some, so I don't see any harm in just letting you count how many per student, how many for faculty.
It depends, doesn't it, about what we're trying to get. If you're doing it, what you're talking about, Karen, then aren't we really saying how many students have publications, not how many publications we have per student? We have how many students have publications. If you're counting that one publication for two students, you're saying, and you're saying this, someone's going to look at this and say, how many of our students publish in that sense? And so the other way around, it seems more what Sunny was trying to get at, which is how many publications we have. There's only one publication there, and maybe two students have it, but only one publication. Does that make sense?
But I think that what I'm saying is, I believe the factor is how many publications does a student have? How many publications does a faculty have? And it is not saying how many unique publications does a faculty have and how many unique publications does a student have. And so that's why I think it's okay to double count, because, it's not saying unique. And they all each have a publication on their CV. It lists, though, maybe multiple authors and says, I'm not the sole author of this publication. So
I think that both those definitions have merit. And again, at the risk of trying to avoid the proverbial splitting of the hairs, I think, in terms of a possible recommendation is that those two are they actually offer different pieces of information. And I perhaps what I'm coming to think is that both those pieces of information are valuable because they teach us different things. One is the number of scholarly bodies of work that get disseminated, and the other is, for every student that we have, what is the average number of publications that they leave the institution with or have at any given time? My perspective, I guess, hearing all sides is that they both have value for an internal audience, for reporting to the coordinating board or that type of thing. They just teach us different things. Dean, do you have a comment?
In fact, not only do they teach us different things, having them both would be informative to someone. Whether they're going someplace that is primarily single author, or someplace which is primarily multiple author, and without judging one's better or worse, it's different.
I agree.
People know that.
Yeah, so I think there is this with this feeling that both pieces of information. I just want to take us one step back and have us think about guarding against overgrowth of the number of characteristics that we're going to report. And so, being very, very guarded, I guess, and that's maybe my perspective. I think there's, you've heard me talk about that proverbial error of the third kind, is just because it's measurable doesn't mean that it's valuable. And so, but I think in this case, that notwithstanding, I think in this case, these are two very meaningful measures. But if I may, just a straw poll, by a show of hands, how many of you think that inclusion of both those pieces of information is valuable? Please. Correct. Correct, yes. Yes. Yeah.
It seems to me, though, it would need to be qualified. If some people are saying, we're going to count all of them that the faculty and the students did, or we're just going to count it one time, that it seems to me it should be qualified.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm envisioning at least is you have number of publications per faculty, or faculty publications, and then there's a student publication section as well. That, I think, based on the discussion we're saying, is being split into two, where you talk about publications per student versus number of publications unduplicated. Does that make sense? James, your thoughts?
Well, before we go too much further, I draw your attention first to the fact these definitions are slightly different. Okay, core faculty activities is an average per year per faculty member, right? It's right there in the definition. For each of the 3 most recent years, the average of discipline-related refereed papers or publications, other accomplishments, issued per core faculty member. Now, if you flip to student publications, for each of the 3 most recent years, the number, not the average, the number of discipline-related refereed papers, et cetera, and external presentations per year.
In either case, there needs to be that clarification. And I only say that because, I'll be real specific, we were in a program, and before our divorce, each one counted very differently. And so to the point of which institution you would pick because of the number and et cetera, it looked disparately different. So that's why it's a question in my head.
And while I agree that both numbers have merit, my thought as a state administrative person is always, clarity, transparency, and keeping things simple. And my concern is if we now ask institutions to calculate 2 numbers for each of these 2 measures, now we're sort of proliferating. We're not just proliferating really the number of measures, but now we've got 2 numbers, and I think that's going to reduce clarity. And honestly, my strong preference, you can make whatever recommendation you want, but my strong preference would be along the lines that Joanne suggests. Either number is valuable, either number can be meaningful, but please let's pick one or the other. And so we'll clearly tell institutions, hey, these criteria should be they can be duplicated or they must be unduplicated. And that way, everyone will be reporting the same thing, and it'll be still relatively easy for someone who's not a graduate dean to look on your web pages and see this and kind of understand what it's trying to say.
Well, if we were to do it the way the definitions were written, it would seem that the faculty ones could be duplicated, because that would represent faculty effort, and the student ones shouldn't be, because that would let you know how many students would publish them.
So I do caution, though, it's not as easy as you think because let's say, though, this is a multi-authored one. One student is from material science, another student is from, electrical engineering. Okay, so now who's going to get to credit that publication? It's really not as easy as it sounds, though, to do the unduplicated. So why not let people do what they want to do, and as long as they're consistent in all their programs?
And then to complicate that even further, it's faculty and students on the same publication.
Well, that's, again, this is, as I understand it, this is not supposed to be a comparative counting exercise. This is a reporting exercise. And so in one sense, no argument should arise about which department gets credit for it. Both departments get credit for it because they had students who got publications, or they had faculty who got publications.
Yeah, on Gregory's note, I'm wondering if we could have departmental activities. Has that been discussed?
No,
it's by program.
It's by program.
There you go.
Yes, I just wanted to remind people that in the characteristics, you can always add an explanatory note. If there's an unusual situation, if there's something that you don't think makes your numbers truly reflect the activity, if, for example, the department as a whole participated in some scholarly activity, like hosted a conference or something, that you want it to be included, it's your webpage that has the characteristics on it. You can put the information that you think is necessary on the web page. What the coordinating board does is have a list of links to your web page. So if you have any explanatory notes for an unusual situation, or if you want to be really clear about how you're counting things, then you can always elaborate on that.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. May I complicate our lives a little bit by making note of a couple of things that I don't fully, I'm not sure of, so please pardon my ignorance. In terms of the graduation rates, I noticed that the new definition asks for the percentage of doctoral students who graduated with their cohort. And one of the things I'm wrestling with is that we have in our program, in some of our programs, we have some students who come in and they're full-time students, and so they go through the program in 3.5 years, and others are part-time. They only take one course per semester, that sort of thing. And so were we to calculate the number of students who graduated with their cohort, we will have two issues. One is what constitutes a cohort, and what does that number mean when somebody is reading it? So just one point. The other has to do with employment profile, and these 2 points are actually related. A lot of the students who come in who are part-time actually have jobs. And so were we to put on our website in some of our disciplines the number of students who got jobs, it might not look all that good because they came in with jobs and they left with jobs. And so it appears that, in fact, having gotten a PhD from our institution didn't really help them very much. So that's a little kind of, I'm not sure what that's going to do. And the third piece, and then I'll be quiet, is the core faculty. It seems to me that if we limit this to 50%, core faculty as those who teach within 50%, that's a good thing to know, because it tells us the level of commitment the institution has to ensure that faculty are concentrating their efforts in the doctoral program. But what it misses is core faculty equivalent, because the faculty who is teaching less than 50% of the time, maybe for a year, doesn't get counted in this. So I know you want us to be parsimonious, but at the same time, by just putting core faculty without knowing core faculty equivalent might miss some important information that folks might want to know about. My thoughts.
Towards the core faculty, I'll give you an example where it is, I think it's very difficult. So we have a material science and engineering program. So we give faculty who supervise PhD students, but that's a program, it's not a department. They don't have tenure in this, and they don't truly teach, even though we do have kind of a few kind of MTLS kind of acronym courses, but then, so I mean, we give them joint appointment nominal if they supervise a PhD student. So when we do this, we would report them as core faculty. But what exactly does it mean 50%? Because they're really faculty of ECE, they're faculty of chemical engineering, they're faculty of mechanical engineering, where they have, and even when the students register for the research hours, they register for in these departments to the, you know, of the faculty who they belong to. I know it may be more of an exception, but the situation like this, it actually makes it extremely tricky. You know, I mean, if anybody asks me to defend this, yeah, I mean, it will be difficult. We'll essentially have 0 co-faculty, even though we have 50 PhD students in the program.
I would call your attention to the end of that, plus other individuals integral to the doctoral program. So, and this is something we actually look at also when you turn in proposals for new doctoral programs, is we ask you, how many core faculty you got? And often I get the question of, James, who can I consider core faculty? You can consider core faculty to be core faculty. If they give an important contribution to the program, they're sitting on dissertation committees, they're mentoring and supervising students, they're teaching courses, any of those things could be considered a significant contribution to the program, then we're generally okay with you considering them to be core faculty. Okay. Because we understand that the definition of exactly what constitutes core faculty isn't always easy to pin down, especially when you have, say, some sort of collaborative or interdisciplinary program. It can get a little tricky. It can also get tricky, I understand, with many of the professional programs. You know, your MDs in particular. I mean, you know, when I reviewed the proposal for UT's new medical school, I was like, wow, they had hundreds of core faculty. But when you understand how the structure for these things is set up, well, it actually makes very good sense to do it that way. So we've tried to construct these in such a way that they will make sense for each of your programs. But yeah, of course, the challenge is that trying to cover something, create something that'll cover everything, oftentimes leaves you with it fitting nothing exactly right. And that's the trade-off we often make in public policy, is we're trying to cover a broad array of situations, and so we have to come up with something that is the best fit. Not a great fit, and certainly not a perfect fit, but it's the best fit for the situation. So do you think so with the idea that the spirit is, hey, these are people that make significant contributions to your doctoral program, do you think then that maybe actually saying full-time is misleading? Is saying tenured and tenure track misleading? Is it the 50%? Are there parts of this that maybe then rather than adding something to it, maybe we should strike one or two things to have it make more sense to you so that it won't seem like such a chore to figure out who your core faculty are? Because my sense is that you guys already know who your core faculty are, and you're just wondering whether they fit within this definition. Is that about right?
I'll offer my perspective. The 50% is what I've struggled with. I don't know if other folks feel the same way, but so I think if that last part is actually the most informative, and it sounds like it gives the programs sufficient flexibility to define that. Even if you added the number of programs and how they define core faculty, that total could in fact exceed the actual head count of faculty at that institution. So I think the 50% has always thrown me. So I don't know if there's an opportunity to strike that and use the rest of it as the descriptor. But I think I saw another hand. Joanne?
I would also ask us to think about deleting the tenured and tenure track, because we have a lot of research faculty now who are neither tenured or tenure track. So maybe striking those four words.
So,
but leave the 50%.
Oh, but leave the 50%.
I would say leave the 50%.
So we could have something like core faculty defined as full-time faculty who teach in the doctoral program and are otherwise are integral to the doctoral program, something like that, right?
Yeah. Like that.
That way it's not quite so prescriptive, but it still conveys this idea that these people are active in the program, they contribute to it in a meaningful way, and the program couldn't get by without them.
Happy to compromise.
Could I get, you said and rather than plus, very different.
I see. So you might have
I don't think I want and, plus.
You might have some full-time faculty who don't teach in the program, but they are still integral to the program. They're still core, they still make significant contributions.
In fact, the simplest definition would be simply all individuals integral to the doctoral program, period, end of statement. That, I mean,
or faculty.
No, why say that? It's the individuals integral to the doctoral program.
No, just that includes staff.
Okay, if you want to say faculty, but is a research scientist title a faculty title? Answer is no, not at UT Austin. But they can supervise PhDs.
Maybe you can say faculty and scientists.
I don't say, well, then you say faculty, scientists, engineers.
I think it's actually important for us to actually come to some kind of agreement on this, because there are a number of things that we use this number as a denominator. So, and that can, we can agree that this is not intended to be used in any other way except the spirit that it's intended. But I think having a number that we all kind of agree upon is useful. So I'll leave it. Mark?
Dean, in response to what you just mentioned, do those individuals that don't have faculty status, they have grad faculty status, so they can supervise or chair committees?
Some do, yes.
Okay.
Well, they have to.
Some don't even have the title of research scientist. Some are professional staff.
As a suggestion, does graduate faculty status, or does graduate faculty capture everything?
At least the way we use it, if they're going to supervise a PhD student, then yes. But now, is that the definition of a core member, those who supervise PhD students? Is that what we meant? I mean, I don't know. That's another possible meaning.
This is also
yes.
Yeah.
For the professional programs, I know that the health science centers within the UT system are very concerned about having to report core faculty, and they don't believe that no matter how we report it, it's going to capture a meaningful portion of the faculty teaching within the medical school.
Not even.
Although, if we just kept the integral, the part that states.
I think that would be better.
Yeah. So, but I think where we're still hung up a little bit is the first part of it. Do we actually define them as faculty, or do we define them as individuals, or do we define them as graduate faculty? I think that's the integral part of it. I think we're all seemingly agreeing on. It's the first part of it. Greg.
One of my other hats is as an accreditation liaison. You could say appropriately credentialed individuals. And that would cover all of these different categories, because in order to serve on whatever committees or teach the classes, they would have to be appropriately credentialed.
Yeah. Appropriately credentialed individuals integral to the doctoral program?
Yes. We have faculty in art, for instance, who have at best a bachelor's degree.
They are still, for your accreditation, appropriately credentialed.
This is the problem. Is now, I mean, if appropriate credential, is that actually a restriction then?
No, it is.
It actually
Yeah.
is. And if you have people who have bachelor's degrees that are teaching graduate courses, you have some poor accreditation liaison writing huge paragraphs justifying that. And that makes them appropriately credentialed.
So not to make a bad pun, but ACPE, which is the Pharmacy Accrediting Board, is fairly prescriptive. So, and they define their this appropriately credentialed faculty very specifically, and include the kinds of degrees that would entitle an individual to participate in curriculum and that sort of thing. So, but Karen.
So I had some comments, two other things. So one, I wanted to go back to the graduation rate, because the part about with their cohort is now confusing. I think before it was 10 years, or currently is 10 years, and I think that there was a lot of feedback that 10 years was a long time. But I think that, kind of now saying, though, their cohort will really cause us a lot of pains, because then people will like, okay, so what year do we use? So I think if we don't want to stay with 10, then we suggest another year, 7 or something. But I don't think we want to have it this vague, because I think it'll be very difficult for us. The other one I wanted to bring up was the one under percentage of full-time students, under the research doctorate. So in the past, it kind of had called it full-time student equivalent, and I think that we were sort of using maybe what the coordinating board uses as full-time equivalent for students, which is different from what we use on our campuses as full-time. And now it looks like maybe it's mixing, because then it goes and it says, though, definition of full-time student is institutional. So if we mean that, then we should take out, I think, equivalent out of the the characteristic, because I think when we think full-time equivalent, we think you're talking about the state and the number of hours that you guys do for master's and doctoral versus on our campuses where we define full-time for graduate students to be a certain number. So I think we should be consistent in which one we mean here. Because I don't know, to me, it now seems mixed.
It had always been in there as a footnote, but I think you're right. I think most of us interpreted it still as what the state wanted, but I guess it was always on here as a footnote. At least it looks like it. I don't know if we recognized that when we were doing this.
And the other matter is, of course, it can vary by program within an institution, right? Because some programs, for financial aid purposes, they've requested us to consider full-time status X, and another it's Y.
So should we say, definition of full-time student according to the CBM reporting manuals or something like that? And that way everyone's using the same definition of what constitutes a full-time student equivalent.
To decide.
That's what you mean, the coordinating board definition, then, yeah.
Yeah, and just.
That way everyone's calculating it the same way, it's very clear.
So what would the value of that definition be from the standpoint of a measure of quality? Because I think I heard at the very beginning of this discussion is that these characteristics are a measure of quality, and we are now talking about measures of quantity. And particularly that particular definition, I'm trying to think in my mind, what about the quality of my program will somebody get by knowing what the percentage of full-time students are based on the state definition?
Well, maybe not quality in the sense of high quality, low quality, but maybe just quality in the sense of the characteristics or the nature of the program. If I'm a student, if I'm a potential grad student, and I intend to go to a program full-time, I might like to know, hey, if I go to this program, are there going to be a bunch of other students like me going full-time? Or are there going to be mostly part-time students? And so I'm not really going to have much in the way of kind of colleagues, because it's going to be a different person in my classes every time because they're all just going 3 or 6 hours a semester. Or vice versa. Maybe I intend to go part-time. Is this a program that seems to emphasize full-time status and most of the students are full-time? People might like to know that.
James, would you also agree that since this variable, percentage of full-time students, also ends up being part of a number of other characteristics that arguably can be perhaps more of a measure of quality, as I think Dr. Herman is mentioning, that justifies its sort of assessment?
Right, because it is sort of a baseline measure then that leads to other measures. Sure.
Just a couple other things, Sonny. I noticed, James, we're going to have some confusion on our campus, and I'm sure other campuses will as well, especially for those in the arts and so on, with the terms we're using now, research doctorate, the DFAs, the DMAs, the EDDs. And so introducing this term is going to probably cause some heartburn, I think, for some of our folks. Is that, I wonder if there's a more generic term, or we said slightly like we did before when we were having the 13 characteristics of professional programs, just have the professional programs and define exactly what we mean by professional programs.
And that's why you've decided not to jump into that. So your institution, Tech will figure that out for itself,
okay,
right?
That's fine.
Tech will decide, okay, which programs are going to report under research and which ones are going to report under professional.
That's
we'll
fine.
Just leave that to you guys.
And having said that, then I think it would be important to include some of these other characteristics in the professional programs, because I think knowing the student-faculty ratio is important for both sets of programs. I think the teaching load is important for both sets of programs. And the last external review would be important for both sets of programs, especially professional programs that are accredited.
Sure, we welcome such a recommendation. If, like I say, if you want to see a few more of these items under the professional category, sure, let's but let's get a recommendation.
So
I think for the other one,
Karen, do you want to?
I was just going to say, I think that there is an external program accreditation date. That's the last one that's common. And I think the one about last external review is really referring to the PhD review that's required by the coordinating board for
Okay,
doctoral ones. So I think,
Well, again,
I think that one, right.
I mention that only because of what James said. If our DFA people decide to go into professional, we do the program review every 6 years for them.
I believe the average institutional financial support provided has changed rather dramatically. It used to be preceded by, for those receiving financial support, that is now gone. And hence, it could have been in the past, if you supported 10% of your students, you reported the average that those students got. Now, it says the average provided per full-time student. Your number would go down rather dramatically. I'm not actually saying which one I think is better, but they're completely different, I think, the old definition and the new.
But I guess maybe that is the question at hand, and I would maybe challenge this group to actually decide, what is the most, in the spirit of identifying the most meaningful measures, recognizing that our institutions are quite varied, and the programs, look at different measures with greater or lesser levels of importance. So on the basis of that, can we address maybe Dean's comments ever so briefly? Which is the more meaningful measure? One where it's the percent of those receiving financial support, or is it just on the basis of total students?
So if I could,
Please.
Given that the next characteristic is the percentage of full-time students with support, personally, I would argue the old definition that tells you those with support, how much do you get paid? And then separately, we already asked for, and how likely are you to get paid?
Right. Yes.
I think leaving it the way it used to be, plus that second piece of information, is more useful than the new version where the number could look really small. Well, you'd already know your chances of getting funding are bad from the next number. So why not tell them what you get paid if you do get paid?
I agree with that.
Okay. James, did you capture that?
Yes. So really, you're talking about making it clear that average institutional financial support provided is per student receiving support.
Right.
I think it's the old definition had for those receiving financial support at the very beginning.
Yeah.
So I think you just put that back in.
Right. For those receiving financial support for each of the 3 most recent years, et cetera, et cetera. Gotcha.
Yep.
Just,
Dimitri?
again, to refine this even further, then we probably, when we talk about average institutional support, it should also talk about full-time students if you want to really get good comparison, if that's the idea. Because in the average institutional financial support provided, we should say it should be for full-time.
I think it's in there.
It says there?
Yeah. Second line,
Or full-time.
Yeah.
support provided.
The old definition
fine.
has it.
Yeah, but it's a good point, yep. Any other?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Did I overhear someone say that although this document suggests that on page 2, all the items under complete only for research doctoral program, those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those 7 items do not show up for complete only for professional doctoral program. So the professional doctoral program do not have to include those items, and the research doctoral program do not have to include average tuition and student passing licensure information.
It's exactly correct.
Well, sorry, what I was suggesting is take the next to last and the 2 bullets before the next to last, and including that in the list required for all programs.
You're referring specifically to date of last external review and student?
Correct.
And student
That's what I was suggesting. So where it says complete only for research doctorates, bullets number, I'll just do it the other way, sorry. Bullets number 4, 5, and 6, I was going to suggest being required for all programs. Because if we're interested in, again, because of this issue of the institutions are going to decide which of these two review tracks are going to take, I think the information about teaching load, student-faculty ratios, and the last review would be important information for all programs. I think James said that would be a recommendation. I would so recommend.
You know, I'm sorry, go ahead, Karen.
I was going to say that I agree with I don't see any issue with the core faculty ratio or the last external review if applicable, but I think the faculty teaching load, from my understanding of many of the first professional programs, so you have a bunch of these, folks who are medical doctors and they have some, so I think the number might not really be of value. That's my understanding.
Well, I would agree. In a medical school environment, that's true. But again, if you're going to let the institution decide which track they want to go through, and the DFA people are going to want to go with this track, or the EDD people are going to go with the professional track, the teaching load's important.
Well, but what I think though is, so for example, I think what we'll do at Texas A&M is we will only put our first professionals in the professional category. And even though we have EDD, we have Doctor of Engineering, we'll say you come under the research one. And that then lets us get that data on those because that makes more sense. So I think though he's saying the institution can kind of look at their composition and decide then what category they could go in. But what I think is going to happen is we put that in the professional one. I know our first professional is going to come back and be pushing and saying, we don't want to do that one because that one doesn't make sense for us. And so, I don't know, it seems like it's easier to put the people you want in the other category versus try to fight with the first professional. So just an opinion.
I would actually also like to add that having the information on faculty teaching load without the complementary information is inherently dangerous because I would hate for there to be conclusions like, looks like 20% of the faculty are teaching 80% of the classes. We must have a lot of cost savings to be had here. That's the kind of stuff that scares the living daylights out of me. And I think if we're going to have this kind of measure, that it needs to be contextualized so that we are able to, and we provide the coordinating board with the ammunition, if I may say, to address that the day in the life of a faculty is far more than that associated with didactic training or classroom education. Just again, something for the coordinating board to consider.
That's fine.
One last comment, if I may. The date of last external review is a little bit problematic for our institution, or at least the graduate school, because we don't do all our areas of focus or majors under the program at the same time. It's staggered because we have as many as 10 traditional majors, 4 specialized majors, specialized meaning more professional, and there, because you can't do all 14 at one time, they get staggered. So for us, it may be a little problematic. But rather than proposing, excluding that, I wanted to maybe take a page out of Karen's narrative and suggest that we put, if applicable, at the end of that. Is that reasonable to
we
you
all stagger those. I mean, we have 120 programs. We don't do them, all at the same time.
Well, I guess
So
I would struggle with, maybe you can guide me on how best do you then define when the last external review was? Because if ours is happening every year, but it's not for all programs, it's just for one program, and then the next year it's another program, and so on.
So what James is talking about, let's say we got a prospective student in biology, pick on my field. They want to know, okay, when was the last time was the program review done? Was that in 2011 or was it in 2016? That's all.
Yeah, and we'll just continue the conversation offline, I think, because we have one degree conferring element, and that is a degree in biomedical sciences. But under there, you have several majors, if you will, focus areas, and we cannot do all of them because they have their own nuances outside of the Common Core. But we'll talk about that.
Sonny, that's not a yes/no answer. You can just list them all.
Right, okay, fair enough. Good, thank you. Other thoughts?
Graduation rate.
Oh, yeah.
Before we leave this item, was that a friendly amendment to take faculty teaching load out, and was that accepted?
Yes.
Okay, great. So now we're looking at putting student core faculty ratio and date of last external review to the all programs section. Is that correct? Great, thank you. Okay, I'm good.
I think we wanted to come back to the graduation rate by cohort issue. I know that's something we would struggle with too, because ours is not a cohort program. So any thoughts to that? Greg?
We had no problems with the 10-year rule. That gave you a measure. It lets you know, 10 years may seem a long time, but we have colleagues that took over 10 years to get a PhD, And if you got the graduation rate per 10 years, that was good. It also captures that a lot of our programs, and again, a lot of our doctoral students or EDD students will take longer because they are going part-time while they work as professional educators. So if there was and I wouldn't even favor reducing the time from 10 years. I think that's a reasonable measure.
Okay, any additional thoughts, comments? I think a lot of us probably would agree that a graduation rate is a valuable measure. I think perhaps at the risk of maybe interpreting incorrectly, I think what Doug was talking about was the use of the word cohort, and to what extent that creates confusion in that, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
But the suggestion to just put 10 years and don't even worry about cohort solves that problem.
Okay, good.
That basically be staying with the way it was defined in the previous.
Correct.
So at the risk of opening anything up, where did we leave the publications discussion? Did we have closure on that one? The count for pubs?
Oh, the count for pubs. I actually had... No, I don't think we did.
We just moved on. Okay.
Put a note.
So why don't we bring that back real quick? So there were, we recognize that the way that's defined right now, we're counting faculty publications potentially by allowing for duplications, but for the students, we had, at least there was some desire to maybe parse that out a little bit more. And at the same time, we're trying to balance the overgrowth of characteristics that we want to report. So I guess what is your perspective? Let's start with you, Joanne.
I'm really open. I just think there should be a little bit of consistency so it doesn't look so lopsided.
So
if we want to duplicate counts and just put a notation, that's what we did, I'm okay with that.
So I think that was perhaps maybe where we left it, was that I think Alan gave us guidance that you can put a footnote and just be clear how you're defining those publications. So we don't need to add a separate line, but if we're in agreement, we would simply clarify by our own explanation. Is that acceptable to the coordinating board, James, Ellen?
So you would have a note you would have a note basically saying this count is duplicative or this count is not duplicative, and you'd have basically a clear statement saying whether you're double counting in some situations or not.
Right, it's just clarifying the methodology. Is everyone okay with that? Sorry, Karen, go ahead.
I was just going to say, maybe a little more positive is just unique, because maybe it's not duplicated, and maybe it is. And you just have a clarification that it may not be unique numbers. Because if you say it's duplicated, but then if it turns out nobody's duplicated, it might sound like it's an inflated number, right? And so, I don't know, I just seem like the word unique, maybe, I don't know. Okay.
That's fine with me.
I know. Okay, so I'm not an English major.
But as Dean pointed out, on the faculty side, at least the way the existing characteristics are phrased, it would be counted, because if Dean and I collaborated, we'd both get to count the publication the way this is phrased.
That's correct. And so
by
again,
definition, that's not unique.
The faculty one,
yeah. And again, I think it's how the institution chooses to define them. And coming back to Greg's point, we're trying to use this as our own internal barometer, and to some extent about what we want to do differently, how that fits into maybe future strategic planning. And on that note, hearing no more discussion, I think in the interest of time, I'd like to move on to the next agenda item. And again, I think it's Alan leading us, and that's the strategic plan.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to give you an update on the timeline and where we're moving on the strategic plan. What we've been doing to date is following very carefully the progress of the RAND study. Charles has done and his team have done some amazing heavy lifting and have done the kind of interviews with institutions and with employers that the coordinating board could not do. They have access to numbers and data on a national basis that we don't easily have, and it's been a tremendous advantage to us at the coordinating board and to all of us at GIAC to have the full resources of the RAND Corporation's people and research resources. So we're extremely grateful to Charles and his team for everything they've done. We want to use that data, and we want to use those recommendations very carefully in the way we conceptualize the strategic plan. So now that Charles's work is approaching completion, we have his recommendations. We have a draft of the data backing it up. So our next step is to use that to come up with a strategy for the strategic plan, a direction for it, a shape of it. Part of that will involve first the coordinating board staff meeting to talk about those recommendations in detail and deciding what our response is going to be to those recommendations, what our action plan is going to be internal to that. We also need to look very carefully at this 60 by 30 text strategic plan of the whole agency and come up with a very clear vision of how graduate education does and does not contribute to that plan, and what we can do to make sure that graduate education participates in the overall context of where the coordinating board wants to go with education in Texas over the next 10 years. So with that in mind, what we want to do is to digest the RAND report very carefully, come up with a working draft of a table of contents and an idea of the overall direction and content of the strategic plan. And then before we go any further with that, bring it back to GIAC for your input and your conversation and consideration of all those items. So the next time we meet will likely be in January or February, late January, early February. And we'd like to have a table of contents prepared by then. And then that'll be where that will help shape, your comments will help shape the content and the nature and the direction of the strategic plan. So that's where we're standing with it. And I believe Sonny had some thoughts about how exactly the GIAC can work with the coordinating board in an agile way in helping to shape that.
So, the discussion that was had a little bit earlier was along the lines of how to get some meaningful initial input to then bring to the larger group. And by inference, the suggestion is maybe a small subset of us is actually on the group that helps create an initial draft that then gets brought to the broader group, rather than having everyone kind of sit through and hammer out some details. And to that end, I guess I'm opening it up for guidance from the GIAC membership about the representation and how we actually identify those. I'll offer one perspective, and that is I don't think a general nomination of individuals is going to work as best, because I worry about the certain institutions or certain types of institutions not being represented. And so I think there would be, actually, to steal a page out of Charles's work, we could go along the lines of making sure that we have a representation from an R1 institution, a emerging institution, a master's intensive institution, and maybe we think about whether there's that emerging versus health science center is sufficiently different that we want one person representing that group as well. And so I guess I wanted to ask how you would like best to have us create that small working group. I think Karen and I represented perhaps 2 of those groups already, and with your permission, we'd certainly be glad to take that on. But again, I'll open the floor up to input as to what the nature of the group should be.
I just want to make sure that we have those that are also with some doctoral programs,
Absolutely.
but are not research emerging.
Agreed. Yeah. And you know, if the terms that we're throwing out are a little confusing, actually Charles' document has a section in there that defines them very specifically, and that's actually the basis of how I'm referencing or using those terms. So that we do capture as diverse a group of people in this working group that then work with coordinating board staff to arrive at a product that you guys can look over and critique and so on.
HSI or MSI piece will be part of that diversity
Yep.
in there, please.
Yep.
Do you just want some people to send you names if they'd be interested, and then you and Karen can sit down and put together a committee? That might be possible.
That would be fine if folks are okay with that process. So just to restate the process that Candy's referring to, those folks that are interested would send names, and then without passion or prejudice, we would identify a subset of those individuals to serve. We'll announce those individuals, and then we'll get to work. Is that a fair process for everyone? Okay. We'll do just that. Anything else we want to talk about? Okay. So any other issues? We want to open up the room for some general discussion of issues affecting graduate education. I'd like to open up with 2 items. One is, it's actually more of an announcement, perhaps, and I would like to offer that at the ATGS meeting, I think there was some good resolution of being an important source of information or input on that they can then provide through the GIAC. I guess one of the things I wanted to ask your thoughts on was how we better engage our constituents, how we better represent the state, how we better engage even within the people at our own institutions. And one of the ways could be, in fact, the ATGS. Again, that's probably part of it's more of a suggestion, I guess, but I think there was enthusiasm, correct me if I'm wrong, that ATGS would certainly want to be an active participant in the dialogue and provide specific input, because we had the benefit of hearing from the commissioner at the ATGS, and it strikes me that we want to have an opportunity to feed coordinating board staff and the commissioner with the kinds of bullets that maybe help him with conversations he may be having with state politicians. And I think so, the desire, as it were, to be at the table through our collective conversation. Does everyone feel comfortable with that One, the ATGS's role. Good. Okay. The other issue is the new FLSA law. I'd like to offer, and maybe something we want to all come back to, or in terms of identifying best practices. All of you are probably well aware that starting December 1st, that salary that defines an exempt versus a non-exempt employee is going up to $47,476. For most institutions, you can't use $47,476 because it's not divisible by 12, but nuance. Anyways, the issue is there are lots of our trainees, lots of ours that can be potentially affected by this. It may be probably more along the lines of postdoctoral trainees, not so much our graduate trainees, actually not graduate trainees. But in any case, something for us to think about. If you all think it's a meaty enough conversation piece, maybe we can come back and share how our respective institutions are dealing with it. I'll now shut up and let other people volunteer any things that they would like to share or bring up issues. Okay, hearing none. Again, we will continue to solicit feedback or input on major discussion items. I think the preceding topic could be one that we talk about. We've got some ongoing things, it sounds like, related to the strategic plan. And I certainly want to add, I had the benefit of giving a short presentation to the Committee on Academic and Workforce Success, or CAUSE, and I assured Ms. Shepard that I would convey her thanks to this group for all their hard work. So they're appreciative of what we're doing, and I think I certainly look forward to more vibrant, spirited discussions on issues that affect us all. Anything?
Just one note. To return to the characteristics one quick time, as you think about this, and now you've got a copy of it, in light of our conversation, if you have any other additional comments to make about specific wording or issues that you see in this draft of the characteristics of doctoral programs that didn't come up today or that occur to you later, please feel free to email those to me directly. That would be great. Over the next 2 weeks or so would be ideal. And we'll certainly take everybody's suggestions, both big and minute, into consideration when we continue the drafts on this. So thanks. It's Alan Mickey, of course, at the coordinating board.
Other thoughts, comments for the good of the order? Going once, going twice. If not, thank you all for your time. We're adjourned.
Thank you all.